Imagine yourself drifting along the edge of an ancient city at dawn, the skyline defined by distant walls and half-finished towers. There's a hush that lingers over empires at their peak, a feeling that everything is ordered and permanent, the markets full, streets busy, and distant borders seemingly secure. Yet, beneath the calm, the rhythm of daily life is marked by small signals, extra taxes, new rules, soldiers on distant campaigns. Within palaces, rulers contemplate expansion, an ever-present desire to build, to claim, to leave a mark beyond their own years. Consider the Empire of Rome, which began as a cluster of villages and, over centuries, extended its roads across continents. Or the mighty Tang in China, whose silk routes and canals brought distant worlds to their door. Their vision drew people together, stone by stone, law by law. But always, as expansion accelerates, daily life becomes more uncertain. New customs mingle uneasily with the old. Merchants grumble about distant governors, farmers worry about conscription, and the pulse of the capital grows restless. You might sense a subtle fragility, like a fabric stretched thin. As centuries pass, the very systems that enabled growth, intricate bureaucracy, vast armies, the weight of tradition, begin to strain. The same walls that promised protection now mark boundaries of distrust. Grain shipments arrive late. Messages from the frontier carry news of rebellions. In quiet rooms, advisors argue over solutions, never quite willing to admit how brittle their world has become. The moment of greatest pride, a triumphant conquest, a new monument, so often conceals the earliest cracks. Empires, in their grandest moments, become most vulnerable to decay. They are built not only on ambition, but on the daily persistence of countless lives. And so, the cycle turns. Vision gives way to ego, expansion to overreach, order to quiet unraveling, each pattern echoing, as if time itself remembers. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow passage in an ancient city, the air cool against your skin as dawn approaches. You pass low doorways where scribes once hunched over parchment, ink slowly seeping into soft fibers. In these quiet places, the first whispers of unwelcome truths took shape, carried by voices that seemed unremarkable at first. Over time, those voices grew clearer, their questions harder to ignore. Yet the rhythm of daily life preferred certainty to doubt, and so the truth-teller's words were often met with a polite turning away, a lowering of eyes. It is a pattern you can trace across centuries. The ones who spoke plainly about what others refused to see found themselves gently pushed to the margins, then exiled entirely. Consider Hypatia of Alexandria, who moved through the colonnades of her city, wrapped in the soft folds of linen, her mind bright with questions about mathematics and philosophy. To her students, she was a guide into deeper understanding, but to those in power, her clarity was unsettling. As she lectured beneath the high ceilings, her voice blending with the murmur of distant markets, she was already marked as a disruption to be erased. Imagine the subtle signals, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet conversation after dusk, that prepared her fate. In the end, the marketplace where she died would be swept clean, the story retold in gentler terms. In quieter eras, the same pattern unfolds behind less imposing walls. A teacher in a small village who questions the fairness of the harvest tax. A printer who dares to reproduce banned pamphlets. Each finds that the cost of speaking exceeds the comfort of belonging. Their lives fill with small warnings, delayed payments, shuttered doors, a lingering gaze that holds both curiosity and disapproval. Even their daily tasks acquire a thin layer of tension, as if every gesture might be recorded, weighed, and judged. And still, centuries later, the rhythm continues. You can almost hear it in the creak of old floorboards and the hush that settles before a story is repeated. The truth-tellers are praised when it is safe to do so, when their absence no longer threatens anyone's comfort. Their words, once condemned, become mottos carved in stone. Their names are recited in classrooms that would never have welcomed them in life. And so it goes. an endless cycle of rejection and remembrance, the same quiet struggle unfolding in every time and place. Imagine yourself standing before an ancient altar at dawn, the stone surface cool beneath your palms. In the half-light, you notice baskets of grain, small clay figurines, and the faint trace of smoke rising from yesterday's offerings. Each object left here was a gesture of submission, an attempt to soothe unseen forces that might withhold the rain or strike illness into the village. The rhythm of their lives depended on these rituals. Even when the harvest was poor and families rationed every handful of barley, they still returned to the shrine, believing that their sacrifice was necessary, even just. In these quiet acts, you see a pattern that repeats across centuries, people giving away what little they possess to entities that rarely give back more than uncertainty. Now, imagine a medieval manor, its tall wooden doors opening to a long hall lined with shields and banners. The Lord's voice is measured as he lists new taxes: coin for repairs, grain for the soldiers, wool for the winter stores. Villagers listen, heads bowed, hands folded, while a scribe scratches the numbers onto parchment. Though their backs ache from the fields and the cupboards at home are already half empty, few speak in protest. Instead, they wait for the tally to end, hoping that compliance will protect them from harsher penalties. When the Lord rises to leave, they murmur blessings, a quiet chorus of gratitude that feels as habitual as breathing. It is a scene that would not look so different centuries later in other lands. Only the language and the symbols would change. These acts of reverence toward power can feel strangely comforting. They create order from chaos, marking the seasons with ceremonies and obligations that rarely pause. Over time, the repetition becomes familiar, almost gentle, even if the cost is high. In some societies, the greatest burden was not only material, but emotional, a sense that failing to appease the powerful could bring shame as well as hardship. And so people learned to praise what hurt them, to find dignity in endurance, to weave hope into every ritual, however small. If you look closely, you may notice how that same impulse echoes quietly in the present day. The instinct to kneel, to offer, to believe that submission is a shield against the unknown. Imagine yourself living in a city anxious with uncertainty. Each day, the rhythm of daily life is broken by rumors of food growing scarce, of neighbors vanishing, of a distant enemy advancing. Into this hush steps a figure who seems to listen, who promises not only to restore order, but to deliver salvation. People gather in candlelit halls, listening for words that will soothe their restlessness. The new leader arrives quietly at first, hands folded, speaking softly of unity and hope. He names the fears you feel but cannot voice. He offers simple answers, and each time he speaks, the tension in the air seems to thin just a little. Slowly, the pattern changes. What began as hopeful assemblies become more organized. Messages appear on doorways and in public squares, reminding you of new laws designed to keep the peace. At first, they seem harmless: curfews, lists of forbidden words, an oath to support the common good. You notice how often the leader's image appears, on coins, banners, even stamped on bread. The lines between private and public life blur. Friends lower their voices, and you find yourself measuring your own words, practicing the quiet caution that everyone else seems to have learned overnight. Years pass. The city still beats with daily rituals, markets opening at dawn, the clatter of carts, the scent of bread thick in the air. But the sense of ease has faded. Instead, there's a rhythm of watching and waiting. The leader, once a gentle savior, now rarely appears in person. Orders arrive through intermediaries. Disagreements are not discussed, but simply disappear. The city remembers, quietly, how the promise of safety slowly replaced the habit of freedom. In homes and courtyards, stories circulate of the first time a neighbor vanished, of the moment people realized the Savior's embrace was tighter than chains. And you wonder, in the hush before sleep, how often in history hope has paved the road to a closed and silent world. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village where the rhythm of daily life unfolds slowly. Fields stretch into the mist, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and smoke from the morning fairs. Along the narrow path, elders speak in low voices of the distant river rising each season, of trees blooming too early or too late. They notice the soil growing thinner, the well water tasting strange, but each warning settles quietly into routine, faded by familiarity. A cracked wall is patched, a muddy track ignored. Danger, here, always seems like tomorrow's problem. In the chronicles of cities, too, the same pattern emerges. In Pompeii, townspeople swept volcanic ash from their steps for weeks before Vesuvius darkened their world. In London, the Great Fire followed years of warnings about timber-packed houses and drought-dry thatch. Warnings became background noise, folded into everyday life, until suddenly, disaster arrived not as a stranger, but as an old rumor finally stepping through the door. Even in the lives of individuals, slow disaster moves quietly. The merchant who loans too generously, always believing fortune will recover. The family ignoring the worn edge of a stone bridge until one spring it falls away with the flood. Each step feels safe, because each day before it was safe. You see the pattern, a gentle drift toward danger, disguised as routine. Modern times echo this rhythm. Sea walls crumble inch by inch, climate warnings repeat, familiar as the sunrise, until the day the water rises too high. There is comfort in the ordinary, in the slow drift. Warnings are easy to dismiss when life continues as usual, when the future always seems far away. Yet if you listen quietly, almost every disaster has a whisper before it roars. Imagine yourself listening for these whispers, feeling the gentle tug of caution beneath the daily noise, the rhythm of our lives unbroken until the moment it is. Imagine yourself wandering quiet streets just before dawn, where new banners hang from windows, and the air still holds the faint, acrid trace of smoke from yesterday's celebration fires. The rhythm of daily life has been broken, familiar routines replaced by a restless hope. In whispered conversations, people speak of freedom, of justice, of the promise that this time everything will be different. You see faces alight with purpose, ordinary people transformed by the belief that they are shaping a new world. As days pass, the energy of revolution becomes a current pulling everyone along. Old orders crumble, statues are toppled, and those who once hid their dreams now speak them aloud. The leaders, often once ordinary, now carried forward by crowds, work late into the night drafting proclamations, setting up assemblies, and overseeing new rituals. Imagine their exhaustion and pride, the scent of ink and sweat in cramped rooms where the future is argued line by line. The sense of possibility is almost tangible. But beneath the momentum, an ancient pattern quietly unfolds. The movement fractures as unity splinters into factions. Suspicion grows. The revolution that promised safety begins to feel unsafe. The very leaders who lit the spark are now questioned, sometimes denounced. You might hear boots on cobblestones at midnight, or find a once celebrated figure missing from the morning's assembly. The rhythm shifts from hope to caution, celebration to fear. Over time, the revolution builds new systems, structures meant to protect its ideals. Yet these often become as rigid and unforgiving as those they replaced. The early heroes, who dreamed so vividly, are swept away by the tides they set in motion. History remembers their faces, but seldom their voices, quietly reminding us that even the bravest can be undone by the very change they made possible. Imagine yourself in a quiet scriptorium where the air smells faintly of ink and warmed parchment. A monk leans over a manuscript, copying each letter with deliberate care. Outside, the wind carries rumors that certain texts, works once read in the open, are now forbidden. In the soft candlelight, the impulse to preserve knowledge flickers alongside the fear of punishment. It is an ancient rhythm. The urge to silence ideas rarely vanishes for long. It simply drapes itself in new justifications, repeating across centuries like a pattern woven into the fabric of human life. Centuries before, in the grand libraries of Alexandria, scrolls containing histories, plays, and scientific observations were gathered from across the known world. Imagine the shelves stretching into dim corridors, the papyrus thick with the scent of dust and resin. When flames finally consumed those halls, it was not just an accident of war. It was also an early glimpse of how fragile ideas become when power feels threatened. Over time, each culture has found its own careful language for erasure. Some speak of protecting morality. Others claim to shield the public from confusion or corruption. Yet beneath these words lies the same quiet conviction that if a thought can be hidden or destroyed, the world might remain orderly. You can see the same impulse much later in small European print shops where presses turned with steady clacks late into the night. Printers wrapped their pages in cloth to smuggle them past watchful city guards. They used false covers and secret compartments, not because the words were dangerous in themselves, but because any challenge to established order was treated as a threat. Even in homes, the rhythm of ordinary life was touched by this caution. A father might tuck a banned pamphlet behind a row of harmless almanacs, the pages crisp and forbidden all at once. A mother might lower her voice when quoting a passage she'd once read aloud without fear. And still, the cycle continues. Modern times bring new tools, screens, networks, algorithms. But the old reflex persists. The methods look different, yet the familiar hush remains. Imagine yourself pausing in a library aisle or scrolling through an archive, aware that some ideas are always one decree away from disappearing. No matter the century, the instinct to control thought wears many costumes, each one claiming to be more reasonable than the last. Yet beneath every ban and every flame lies the same quiet certainty that words, if left unguarded, will keep reshaping the world. Imagine yourself in a candlelit study, the air thick with the scent of melting wax and ink. A scholar bends over a cluttered table, sketching diagrams of the human body on parchment. Outside the window, the town square is hushed, but rumors already circle through the narrow streets. To many, these drawings are not simply observations, they are dangerous symbols, a challenge to beliefs that have shaped generations. The rhythm of daily life depends on old certainties, and each new discovery feels like a small tremor beneath familiar foundations. In the 18th century, when physicians first proposed the idea of vaccination, it was met with suspicion and scorn. Imagine a village meeting hall, low voices rising in concern as neighbors debated whether a droplet of disease could really protect the body. Some called it an insult to nature's order. Others whispered that it was a form of witchcraft, a reckless attempt to play God. Even as evidence slowly gathered, proof that smallpox could be tamed, the fear clung stubbornly to every conversation. Over time, this fear softened into acceptance, but only after countless arguments, pamphlets, and quiet acts of bravery by families who trusted the unfamiliar. A similar pattern unfolded with electricity. Picture a crowded parlor where a scientist demonstrates a simple current flowing through a copper wire. The audience leans back, uneasy, as a faint spark jumps between contacts. To modern eyes, it might seem harmless, almost quaint, but in that moment, it felt unsettling, a force both invisible and powerful. The idea that lightning itself could be harnessed to light lamps and drive machines seemed closer to alchemy than practical knowledge. Slowly, as the glow of electric bulbs began to replace the flicker of oil lamps, the wonder and suspicion blended together, transforming fear into cautious curiosity. You might notice how these patterns echo even today. When a new idea first appears, something that reshapes how people understand the body, the mind, or the world, it rarely slips quietly into daily life. Instead, it arrives with controversy, debate, and a soft undertone of dread. Over time, familiarity wears down the edges of that dread. What was once heresy becomes science. What was once rebellion becomes progress. And in the spaces between each breakthrough, you can sense the quiet resilience of those willing to question, to explore, and to endure the long, patient work of replacing fear with understanding. Imagine yourself in a small town where the market square is paved with worn stones, each one polished by centuries of footsteps. In this place, to be exiled is to be forgotten, or so it seems at first. When a dissenter is led beyond the gates, the town returns to its familiar rhythms. Merchants arranging produce in neat rows, children chasing stray dogs, elders sitting under awnings telling the same patient stories. The name of the exiled person is spoken less often, replaced by small silences and cautious glances. Yet the memory never disappears completely. It lingers like the scent of smoke long after a fire has been put out. Over time, the absence itself begins to shape the story. Imagine the narrow lanes where the dissenter once walked, the doorway they always paused beside, the quiet conversations held just out of sight. As seasons change, people find themselves repeating fragments of their words, first in hushed tones, then with a kind of tender defiance. The exile's name grows larger in memory than it ever was in life. Neighbors pass along recollections, polishing them into legends. A small resistance takes root, not in open rebellion, but in gestures. A symbol chalked on a wall, a candle lit at dusk, a worn scrap of writing hidden under a floorboard. Generations later, the children of those who stayed begin to ask why the exile was sent away. Their curiosity carries a quiet power. What was once a shameful story becomes a mark of distinction. The outcast is no longer merely someone who left, but a figure who revealed the limits of belonging. In this way, absence transforms into presence, and rejection into a curious kind of reverence. As you drift towards sleep, consider how often the ones cast aside, by decree or by fear, find their names growing brighter in the spaces they leave behind. Imagine yourself standing in a grand hall lined with tall shelves of documents. The air is still, thick with the smell of old paper and wax. Clerks move slowly among ledgers, recording shipments, taxes, and names with small, precise strokes. Nothing about this scene suggests collapse. In fact, it looks orderly. The empire's machinery continues to hum in low rhythms, each note sounding almost reassuring. But beneath the neat handwriting and polished floors, something has already begun to decay. In the final years of Rome, it was like this. Edicts were issued, coins debased in careful increments, walls patched rather than rebuilt. From the outside, life appeared to proceed with little disruption. Markets opened each morning, the bathhouses filled with murmuring voices, and scribes recorded imperial decrees. Yet those same decrees often arrived too late, or never reached the frontier at all. Slowly, the gap between appearance and reality widened. Collapse was not heralded by a sudden crash, but by a steady thinning of competence and trust. Imagine a merchant in Constantinople counting his coin, noticing each silver piece felt lighter than last year's, or a farmer near the Rhine watching a tax collector ride past without stopping, neither of them willing to ask why. The moment felt normal, almost dull. That is the nature of decline. It wears the mask of routine. Even in modern times, collapse seldom begins with chaos. A company fails in quarterly reports before layoffs. An ecosystem falters as insects vanish quietly. A relationship ends not with a single argument, but with months of polite silence. Each stage looks deceptively stable, so you can picture it. The neat rows of records, the officials going about their tasks, the reassuring tick of the clock in the background. Nothing demands alarm. Nothing feels out of place. Yet, beneath the surface, the shaking has already started. The rhythm of life continues, unbroken, until the moment it doesn't. Imagine yourself in a village after a hard winter, where the fields lie muddy and silent beneath a sky thick with low clouds. Along narrow lanes, doors are closed tightly, and conversation drifts in cautious, muffled tones. The rhythm of daily life is uneasy, meals are smaller, laughter rare, and eyes glance quickly away when strangers pass. A sickness has spread, or perhaps a sudden disaster has swept through. In the aftermath, those who have lost most often find themselves under suspicion. In every age, it seems, the burden of suffering rarely brings sympathy alone. People whisper explanations. Someone must have brought this fate upon the community. Perhaps it was the newcomer, or the quiet widow, or the family living at the edge of town. Imagine the feeling of being watched, every gesture weighed and questioned. Even as grief lingers, accusations swirl, settling on those least able to defend themselves. In the crowded alleyways of medieval cities struck by plague, victims were sometimes accused of dark rituals or secret sins. During times of famine, suspicion fell on those who looked different or worshipped in another way. You might hear stories of neighbors denouncing neighbors, or authorities seeking order by finding someone to blame. The rhythm of daily life twists into a pattern of fear and avoidance. Old friends turning away, familiar faces closing shutters. Over time, these cycles of blame and punishment echo through generations. The suffering are marked not only by their losses, but by the stories told about them. And so, history quietly records how tragedy can be compounded, as victims become scapegoats, held responsible for pain that was never theirs to bear. The fields recover, the city's streets fill again, but those accused are seldom truly welcomed back. Imagine yourself in a narrow attic room, the floorboards uneven beneath your feet, and the walls lined with rough canvases turned to face the plaster, as though shy of being seen. The air is heavy with the tang of linseed oil and the softer sweetness of old wood. Here, an artist spends hours in quiet concentration, brush moving steadily through the afternoon light. Though each stroke will one day define an era, the rhythm of daily life pays little attention. Neighbors pass on the stairs without pausing. The landlord waits patiently, then impatiently, for rent that seldom comes on time. This quiet obscurity has followed countless creators. In the cafes of Paris, Vincent van Gogh sometimes traded paintings for meals, slices of bread, a cup of coffee, perhaps a bowl of soup. He wrapped his canvases in coarse cloth and carried them under his arm like parcels of little consequence. The world beyond the cafe windows went about its business, unaware that his restless lines and vivid colors would one day shape how millions would understand beauty itself. But in his lifetime, the applause never arrived. Recognition drifted just out of reach, as if tethered to a future he would never see. You can sense the same pattern in the lives of poets and composers, whose days unfolded in a gentle struggle between necessity and inspiration. Imagine a composer hunched over a piano in a rented room, candlelight pooling across worn sheet music. Outside, the city settles into evening, indifferent to the melodies rising behind thin walls. Each note carries the quiet hope that someone, someday, might understand, yet the applause, if it ever comes, will arrive when the keys have long fallen silent. And still, the cycle continues. The artist's worth often blooms after their absence, when galleries hang their work in carefully lit halls and scholars write essays in polished prose. Imagine yourself in such a gallery, the hush of reverence all around you. It is a comforting ritual, this posthumous admiration. But it never quite erases the fact that, while they were alive, these creators were left to navigate poverty and doubt. The rhythm of their lives, so often invisible, leaves a trace you can feel in every brushstroke, every line of verse, every note that lingers in the air long after it has faded. Imagine yourself standing near the edge of a medieval village just as the sun begins to slip behind the fields. A small group of travelers approaches along the narrow road, their carts piled with bundles wrapped in coarse cloth. You can hear the muffled creak of wooden wheels and catch the faint smell of spices, strange to your nose, unfamiliar, and a little unsettling. At the gate, villagers gather in a loose semicircle, their eyes wary, their hands resting on tools that could quickly become weapons. The rhythm of this place depends on predictability. Anything that unsettles that rhythm, any sign of difference, is met first with suspicion. Throughout history, the arrival of outsiders has almost always carried this same undercurrent of tension. When immigrants disembarked at new ports, they brought languages that sounded rough to local ears and customs that seemed illogical or even threatening. In many towns, official records carefully cataloged every newcomer, noting what they carried, where they planned to settle, and whether their presence might disrupt the fragile balance of trade and labor. And yet, over time, those same strangers often became part of the community's fabric. Their children grew up speaking the local tongue, their foods blended into the daily meals, and their skills quietly reshaped the economy. What was once cause for alarm gradually softened into a kind of familiarity. Consider the story of early settlers in distant colonies. The first months were marked by deep uncertainty, with native inhabitants viewing the newcomers as intruders, and the settlers regarding their hosts with equal caution. Records describe tense exchanges over land and resources, punctuated by long periods of watchfulness. But decades later, history books would retell these encounters as the beginning of a shared heritage, casting the same arrivals that were once feared as the heroic founders of a new society. The edges of conflict were smoothed away by time until only the narrative of origin remained. If you pause to look around your own surroundings, you may see echoes of this pattern. New faces and ideas still meet resistance before acceptance. The cycle repeats itself with quiet persistence. Fear, suspicion, gradual accommodation, and finally, the soft glow of belonging. In the spaces between each phase, you can sense the slow work of memory transforming strangers into neighbors and neighbors into ancestors. Imagine yourself in a quiet village surrounded by fields that roll out to the horizon like a green sea. Each morning, the rhythm is steady and predictable. The soft clink of milk pails, the low murmur of neighbors greeting one another, the creak of shutters opening to let in the dawn. It has been many years since anyone here worried about raids or sudden scarcity. In this long season of calm, the stories of past dangers have become something almost ornamental. Tales reserved for winter evenings when the hearth is warm and the wind rattles the eaves. At first, peace feels like a gift too simple to question. Children grow up never learning the rituals of vigilance. They do not practice hiding places or secret signals. The grain stores are left unguarded, the watchtower unmanned, because nothing has happened for so long that it seems nothing ever could. The elders who still remember darker times sometimes try to share their caution, but their warnings sound outdated, like fragments of an old song no one can quite recall the tune to. Slowly, the village forgets the shapes that danger wears. Then, one morning, there is a change so small it almost goes unnoticed. A distant column of smoke, a set of unfamiliar footprints near the riverbank, a door left ajar in the night. Even when these signs appear, most people find reasons to dismiss them. After all, the mind resists letting go of a comforting rhythm. It is only when danger stands openly at the threshold that recognition dawns, and by then, it often arrives too late. As you drift into rest, consider how peace, left unexamined, becomes a gentle erasure of memory. The longer it lasts, the more it blurs the outlines of what once kept communities watchful. And in that forgetting lies a quiet vulnerability, an invitation, unspoken and unrecognized, for old dangers to return. Imagine yourself in a small town square, just after dawn. The stones underfoot are cool with dew, and the air holds the promise of a peaceful day. Notices are pinned to the wooden boards near the fountain, new laws promising safety from threats beyond the walls. A curfew, they say, to keep order. A registry to track newcomers, a levy to fund the guards. At first, no one feels alarm. These measures arrive folded inside the language of protection, each rule described as temporary, each regulation offered as a kindness. You can almost see a merchant studying the notices, one hand resting on his satchel, wondering if these changes will matter much. In his mind, Safety and restriction blend together, each reinforcing the other. Over weeks, the guards grow more numerous, their polished armor reflecting the morning light. They patrol slowly, offering polite nods, reminding citizens that vigilance is necessary. In ancient Athens, citizens once gathered freely to debate under the olive trees, voices rising with conviction. But even there, the desire for security crept in. Extraordinary powers were granted to protect against conspiracies, and assemblies slowly narrowed in purpose. Soon, the rhythms of open dialogue shifted into a pattern of caution and compliance. You might picture a scholar in the Library of Alexandria, carefully copying scrolls that describe these transitions. How freedom yields, one decree at a time. The same pattern appears across centuries. The comfort of protection expands until it shapes every hour of the day. Imagine yourself watching these rules accumulate like fine layers of dust. None feels oppressive, Olin. Each arrives with the promise of relief, a shield against some unseen harm. But in time, the shield grows heavy. The rhythm of their lives becomes a quiet surrender, so gradual no one feels the moment when safety becomes control. Imagine yourself strolling through the shadowed avenues of a grand city, where palaces gleam in the sun while crowded markets bustle below their gaze. The rhythm of daily life is quietly divided. High above, banquet halls echo with laughter and silver, while down below, the scent of bread is rare and coin purses light. Each day, the gap between plenty and need seems to widen, a gentle but persistent pressure shaping every interaction, every hope. You might notice how resources flow upward, taxes collected from distant farms, goods gathered from laborers, and the finest grains all find their way to the tables of a privileged few. The streets near the center sparkle, but at the city's edge, walls crumble and roofs leak. The pulse of the marketplace carries both rumor and resentment. Merchants speak in hushed voices of new levies, and farmers count each sack twice, wary of shortages. Still, the outward show remains: festivals, parades, and monuments, all intended to reassure that the order is eternal. Yet, beneath the surface, the system grows brittle. The more the elite accumulate, the less remains to sustain daily lives at the margins. Imagine the slow tension building, families skipping meals, craftsmen leaving their trades, neighborhoods turning inward with suspicion. The structure endures until a small spark, often unseen, ignites a surge from below. Crowds gather, voices rise, and suddenly the grand halls that seemed so secure echo with uncertainty. Over and over, history repeats this quiet cycle. Empires are built on unequal exchanges, and wealth, hoarded long enough, becomes a weight no structure can bear. When collapse comes, it is both sudden and inevitable, leaving the city silent for a time until the rhythm of ordinary life begins again, shaped by new hands, with old lessons lingering in memory. Imagine yourself standing in a village square where the air feels thick with unease. A famine has settled over the land, and each day the bread loaves grow smaller. In this hush of hunger, eyes begin to search for a cause, for someone to blame. It never takes long. A widow who sells herbs, a family who worships a different god, a stranger who speaks with an unfamiliar accent, all become the convenient answer to collective fear. You can almost hear the low murmur of suspicion, spreading like a slow fog. In medieval Europe, this pattern unfolded again and again. During the Black Death, desperate towns accused Jewish communities of poisoning wells, though there was no proof. Imagine the rhythm of their lives, interrupted by sudden panic, doors splintered in the night, quiet streets turning hostile without warning. Even centuries later, the same reflex appeared. When economies collapsed, when empires lost wars, a group was chosen to carry the weight of everyone's dread. It was simpler to believe a single enemy existed than to accept a world governed by chance and disease. The cycle always returned. Uncertainty bred fear. Fear demanded a target, and blame promised relief, however temporary. Imagine yourself in a small room lit by a single candle, the walls close and the air thick with quiet tension. A lone figure leans over a worn desk, writing carefully, each word a risk. Outside, the world continues in its familiar rhythm, unwilling to hear ideas that unsettle the comfortable order. It has always been this way. When Galileo described a universe that did not revolve around Earth, he was called a heretic. When early abolitionists argued that all people deserved freedom, they were mocked and threatened. Their voices were punished before they were understood. In villages and cities, new thoughts often arrive as unwelcome guests. They bring discomfort, asking people to question traditions that feel as steady as stone. Those who speak them out loud are labeled troublemakers or fools. But over time, the same words that inspired fear begin to feel inevitable. What was once rebellion becomes common sense. Consider the quiet defiance of unknown workers who demanded fair pay or safer conditions. Though their names were seldom recorded, their persistence shaped laws and rights that seem ordinary now. If you look closely, you'll find this pattern everywhere. A lone voice, ignored or silenced, then slowly embraced. The arc is rarely gentle. It bends through struggle and solitude before it ever becomes a banner others will carry. And in that slow transformation, you can sense how each era must relearn the value of listening before judging. Imagine yourself standing in an old archive room where the air is thick with the scent of parchment and dust. Along each wall, shelves groan under the weight of photographs, carefully labeled and arranged in neat boxes. Each image captures a moment that someone believed was worth preserving: a parade in the square, a family gathered under the heavy branches of a summer tree, a council signing papers that promised lasting change. At first glance, it feels reassuring to know these records exist, that the past has been pinned into place like pressed flowers behind glass. Yet as you study each photograph, you begin to notice how much is missing. The angle of the camera chooses what is seen and what is left out. The expression caught in a fraction of a second becomes the entire story, while everything before and after dissolves into silence. Over time, people start to rely on these images to tell them not just what happened, but how it felt to be there. The records grow heavier, more numerous, and strangely less reliable. You can almost sense how the rhythm of memory shifts, how the mind begins to surrender its own recollections in favor of whatever is easiest to retrieve. Imagine the children of that town, growing up surrounded by glossy prints of events they never witnessed. When they look at those images, they feel a kind of certainty, an illusion that they understand days long vanished. But the truth is softer, more complicated. The real experience, the weather that day, the small arguments, the unspoken hopes, has faded behind the convenience of a single image. Over generations, these records become like a familiar lullaby, comforting but incomplete. As you prepare to drift into sleep, consider how each photograph is both a record and an erasure. The more we document, the more we risk mistaking the record for reality. And in that quiet confusion, history becomes not just what happened, but what we have decided to remember. Imagine yourself standing beneath the marble colonnades of an ancient city often called a golden age. Sunlight glints across smooth stone. Statues look down with unblinking eyes. From a distance it seems perfect, prosperous, refined, dignified. But if you pause to listen more carefully, you'll hear quieter notes beneath the brightness. Servants moving silently along the walls, prisoners in hidden courtyards, awaiting judgments no one speaks of openly. History has a way of polishing these eras into legends. The Renaissance glows in memory as an age of art and discovery. Yet behind each masterpiece was the weight of patronage, secrecy, and control. Artists often labored under constant pressure, their creativity bound by the whims of powerful families who demanded flattery in pigment and marble. In the quiet corners of Florence, gossip flickered about exiles and betrayals, but these stories softened in retelling. You might picture a scribe in a candlelit study, recording triumphs and omitting failures. The Golden Ages were not only built on innovation and beauty, but also on exploitation, on fields worked by unseen hands, on voices carefully excluded from the record. Imagine the lavish banquets in Versailles, chandeliers scattering light across silk gowns. The splendor felt complete, the music drifting into the gardens. Yet beyond the walls, peasants carried burdens that made this brilliance possible. Their stories often ended unrecorded or reduced to footnotes. The pattern repeats through time. What is celebrated as an age of progress is nearly always balanced by silence or hidden suffering, so you can see it. The polished surface, gleaming in memory, concealing layers of uncertainty and quiet struggle. Imagine yourself walking through such a place. Each step echoes in the stillness, and for a moment you sense the hollow space beneath the golden veneer. The rhythm of their lives was never as simple as the stories suggest. Imagine yourself tracing the faint lines on a weathered map, the paper soft at the edges and ink faded with age. Each border seems so final, a crisp demarcation separating lands, languages, and lives. But behind every line, there is a history of conflict, migration, and change. The rhythm of daily life in these regions once flowed freely, as families farmed the same fields for generations, or traders crossed rivers without checkpoints or guards. When you walk through these borderlands, the landscape itself often holds memories that the map cannot show. Ruined walls stand where battles raged. Villages straddle invisible lines, their traditions blending and overlapping. The air is thick with stories, of alliances forged and broken, of neighbors who became strangers with the stroke of a pen. The gentle clatter of market stalls, the scent of spices, the lilt of dialects, all reveal a history deeper than any document can capture. Yet, the drawing of borders rarely comes peacefully. Armies move, towns are divided, and families are sometimes forced to choose sides. Old roads become barriers, familiar paths are patrolled by new authorities. Imagine the quiet unease as people adjust to new rulers, new currencies, new rules that do not match their memories. The rhythm of life grows tentative, traditions quietly guarded in private, while official histories are rewritten. Over time, the border itself becomes a kind of silence, a pause in the continuity of culture. Entire ways of living may vanish, remembered only in songs or the shape of tools buried in earth. And so, while the map offers clarity, the land beneath it remembers something more complex, a story written in the daily choices of those who lived before lines were drawn, and in the persistent echoes of what has been erased. Imagine yourself in a small chamber, lit by a single flickering lamp. A man sits cross-legged on the cold stone floor, scribbling visions onto scraps of parchment. His voice is quiet, but his eyes burn with conviction. He tells anyone who will listen that the river will flood, the harvest will fail, the empire will fall. But the townspeople pass by, shaking their heads. His words feel like distant thunder, too abstract to worry about, too unsettling to believe. This is the rhythm of his life, warnings offered, warnings ignored. Across centuries, prophets have spoken of catastrophe or transformation. Cassandra in ancient Troy foretold ruin, but no one believed her until the gates burned. In medieval villages, wandering preachers cried out about moral decay, only to be dismissed as mad. Imagine the frustration. A mind filled with patterns others refuse to see. Each night, he dreams in symbols, walls cracking, fields blackening, cities swallowed by waves. But in daylight, these visions dissolve in the noise of daily survival. The cycle is unchanging. A prophet's voice is never welcome when life feels stable. Only when calamity arrives does memory return, and the words, once scorned, sound like undeniable truth. By then, the cost has already been paid. Imagine yourself walking through a silent library just before dawn. The shelves stretch high above your head, lined with volumes bound in cracked leather. The scent of aged paper lingers in the cool air. Each book holds ideas that once felt urgent, carefully recorded so they would never be lost. Yet history shows that knowledge often vanishes, not through accident, but intention. When power shifts, libraries are emptied or burned, their contents declared forbidden. Centuries ago, in Alexandria, scrolls that gathered the wisdom of many cultures disappeared as empires rose and fell. Some were destroyed in fire, while others were quietly hidden, locked away to keep their influence contained. You can almost picture the hands that carried them into hidden rooms, believing that words alone could threaten the shape of society. Even in more recent times, governments have collected and sealed away research they feared would challenge their authority. Scientific discoveries, medical practices, and historical records have all been buried under layers of secrecy. The pattern repeats. Ideas are too dangerous to share, too powerful to destroy outright. So they are kept out of reach, waiting for a different moment. If you look closely, you'll see that knowledge rarely disappears by chance. More often, it is removed carefully, one page at a time, until silence fills the place where questions once lived. And in that quiet, you can feel the weight of all that was hidden, waiting to be found again. Imagine yourself waking in a town that looks, at first glance, unchanged. The rooftops still catch the dawn light in soft, familiar angles. The shopkeepers sweep the thresholds of their stores, as they have every morning for years. Yet there is something beneath the surface, an undercurrent that prickles at the edge of awareness. Notices appear on the walls, written in language that is both polite and unmistakably firm. New requirements, new restrictions, a request for loyalty that does not feel entirely optional. As the weeks pass, the rhythms of life shift in small but persistent ways. The market stalls offer less variety, and the cost of the simplest goods edges upward. Neighbors exchange wary glances as they count out coins, weighing the cost of speaking aloud against the comfort of silence. Some remember other times when the same patterns unfolded: rising prices, promises of quick solutions, reminders that unity demands sacrifice, but the memory feels blurred, softened by years of relative calm. Imagine yourself listening to a speech in the square. The words have a practiced warmth. They promise protection from vague threats, reassurance that any hardship is temporary. Yet you notice the quiet around you, how no one dares to ask questions, how the applause feels measured, almost rehearsed. The same phrases echo again and again until they begin to sound familiar in a way that is unsettling. You find yourself recalling stories your grandparents told about leaders who began by offering stability and ended by demanding devotion. As you prepare to rest, consider how history has a rhythm that repeats itself, even when we believe we are hearing something new. The alarm bells do not always clang loudly. Sometimes they whisper in a tone that is almost comforting, lulling us into thinking we have nothing to fear. And in that hush, the familiar warnings return, asking whether we will listen this time or look away once more. Imagine yourself in a dim chamber lined with carved wooden benches. The air feels cool against your skin, heavy with the scent of ink and wax. Clerks move patiently among tall stacks of petitions, each record a quiet plea for resolution. A farmer waits years for a ruling on a disputed field. A merchant files complaint after complaint, each stamped and shelved, never answered. In these slow corridors, justice feels almost like forgetting. Time drips forward without urgency. You can picture a woman standing at the threshold, fingers tracing the edge of a worn ledger. She has waited so long for a judgment that the original wound feels dull, almost abstract. But justice does not vanish. It collects pressure in hidden spaces, resentment, disappointment, the uneasy knowledge that fairness is always just out of reach. In ancient Rome, citizens appealed to magistrates who might take months or years to reply. A case could vanish into silence, only to resurface abruptly, with punishments that startled even those who had demanded action. A fine tripled, a property seized, a family name struck from the rolls. What began as a patient hope for fairness ended as sudden, merciless retribution. Imagine the quiet before the decree arrives. A lull so long it becomes a part of daily life. Then, Without warning, the hammer falls. This is the rhythm of delayed justice, calm at first, almost indifferent, before it swings to harsh extremes. You can see it even now. Bureaucracies that process complaints at a glacial pace until public outrage gathers and erupts. Then policies shift overnight, penalties multiply, reputations collapse. Delayed justice becomes something less measured and more like vengeance. Picture yourself in that chamber again. The same slow rustle of parchment, the same patient clerks. No alarm sounds when the tide begins to turn. Yet you feel it in the air, a tension that waits and waits until it can no longer stay quiet. Imagine yourself sitting quietly in a dim room as evening falls, listening to distant voices carry through open windows. There is a gentle hush, an undercurrent of expectation that shapes each day, even in the hardest of times. Hope, like a subtle fragrance, drifts through the lives of ordinary people. It is the reason a farmer sows seeds after years of drought, or a prisoner marks the passing days on a wall, dreaming of release. The rhythm of daily life bends around this persistent yearning, a feeling that things might change, that tomorrow could bring relief or renewal. Yet hope can be a weight as well as a comfort. Entire communities have waited years, sometimes lifetimes, for a promise to be fulfilled, clinging to hope even as each day's evidence suggests otherwise. You might picture a village gathered around the same well, sharing old stories of rescue or transformation, holding tight to the belief that someone, someday, will arrive to save them. The air is thick with longing, even as routines grow weary and voices grow thin with repetition. At other times, hope flares up suddenly, a torch in the darkness that sets change in motion. A single rumor, a bold declaration, or an unexpected act can awaken crowds and overturn centuries of silence. Imagine the energy as neighbors, once resigned, rise together, risking everything for the chance that life could be different. Hope has toppled empires, built new worlds, and driven people far beyond what reason or caution would allow. But hope can also mislead, keeping people bound to fading dreams or endless waiting. It can trap as easily as it inspires. The rhythm of history is marked by both long, patient endurance and sudden, risky leaps. In every age, hope is both a trap and a torch, holding people fast, yet making them rise again and again when all evidence suggests they should not. Imagine yourself in a warm room where the shutters are drawn tight against the chill. The hearth glows with steady embers, and the quiet feels almost protective. Over time, you stop checking the locks. You forget how quickly calm can unravel. This is the rhythm of comfort. It dulls the edge of watchfulness. In old port cities, merchants thrived under long years of peace. They built tall houses and filled them with silk and grain. But prosperity bred an easy confidence. Walls were left unguarded, gates unbarred. And one night, raiders slipped in through an unlatched door. History repeats this pattern. In the decades before great wars, people believed progress would never end. They trusted treaties, strong walls, familiar routines. But each promise of safety carries the seeds of neglect. Imagine the moment the first warning arrives, a distant fire, a rumor, a knock in the dark. By then, the habit of vigilance has vanished. Complacency is patient. It settles beside comfort like a silent guest, waiting for the moment no one remembers it is there. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a wide avenue as dawn softens the sky. A crowd gathers slowly, carrying handmade signs and wearing expressions both tired and determined. The rhythm of footsteps begins to build, steady as a heartbeat. When the first voices rise in unison, you notice that their chant feels familiar. Words once shouted by other marchers decades earlier now return with new urgency. Throughout history, protests have carried the same phrases across generations. Calls for dignity, fairness, and respect are woven into banners that look worn, as if they've been unfolded many times before. Each march feels like a new spark, but the cause beneath it is often unchanged. Consider workers striking for safe conditions in the early 1900s. Their chants demanded basic rights that, in many places, still require defending. Or imagine the civil rights marches of the 1960s, where songs of freedom filled the air. Today, those same songs reappear, joined by fresh voices and different faces, but echoing the same pain. If you listen closely, you can sense how each generation inherits unfinished struggles. The date on the calendar moves forward, but the reasons to gather remain. In the quiet moments before the chant begins again, there is a brief, almost tender recognition. The march is not only protest, but memory. A reminder that progress rarely travels in a straight line, and that every step is linked to those who came before. Imagine yourself in a city where the coins no longer feel certain in your hand. The markets still open at dawn, the stalls arranged with neat displays of grain and cloth, but the rhythm of exchange has grown uneasy. Each week, the price of flour creeps higher. Merchants weigh copper coins with a practiced frown, testing whether the metal is as pure as it once was. The weight feels thinner, the shine duller. People carry their purses a little closer to the chest, watching for signs that the value might slip again. In quiet corners of the city, you hear stories whispered in the same careful tone, of traders refusing payment in the local currency, of wages that no longer cover the cost of a single meal. Imagine the small, constant adjustments that follow: recipes stretched thinner, candles burned only halfway, debts recorded in ledgers with uncertain numbers. The coins themselves become symbols of a trust that is slowly unraveling. Once, they were stamped with the promise of the state's strength. Now, each transaction feels like an act of quiet doubt. Over time, the language of money begins to change. Where once people spoke confidently of wealth and security, they now trade rumors of debasement and counterfeit. Inflation becomes an everyday woe, an invisible tide that lifts the cost of living just beyond reach. And in that rising tide, the first fractures in the empire's foundations become visible, not in the grand palaces or the carved monuments, but in the simplest act of buying bread. As you settle into rest, consider how often currency reveals the health of a civilization. Long before borders collapse or armies are defeated, the coins in your palm begin to whisper the truth. Money is a kind of promise, an unspoken agreement that tomorrow will look much like today. When that promise frays, it is the first signal that an empire's heartbeat has begun to fade. Imagine yourself in a grand hall lined with tall columns, the ceilings painted with triumphal scenes. A hush hangs over the polished floors as advisors in embroidered robes confer in low voices. Their words carry the weight of certainty. No matter what rumors swirl outside these walls, about empty granaries, restless garrisons, or distant fires, they assure each other that everything remains under control. This is how collapse so often begins, not in the streets, but in the minds of those entrusted to see clearly. The higher their rank, the more insulated they become. Each report is softened before it reaches their desks, each warning wrapped in polite language. You can almost see a steward approaching with another scroll, hesitating before delivering bad news, afraid to contradict the serene confidence of the experts. In the final decades of the Western Roman Empire, officials insisted the borders were secure, even as entire provinces slipped away. Coins were struck, bearing proud slogans of eternal victory, passed from hand to hand as supplies dwindled and roads grew unsafe. From the outside, the symbols remained: eagles, laurels, proclamations. But inside, certainty had begun to rot. Imagine a scholar seated near a window, recording the proclamations of emperors who promised renewal, each more desperate than the last. As famine spread and legions deserted, these declarations became almost ceremonial. The experts dismissed each sign as temporary, each alarm as exaggerated. You can see this pattern echo in more recent times. Financial markets rising on hollow gains, leaders assuring the public that all is well, that the system is too robust to fail. The higher their titles, the deeper their conviction that decline could not touch them. Picture yourself standing quietly among them, listening as their confident voices fill the hall. No one seems worried, yet beyond the grand doors, the walls are already beginning to crack. The rhythm of certainty continues, unbroken, until the moment the ceiling falls. Imagine yourself standing in the empty square of a once bustling town, the air tinged with the faint, sharp scent of burnt herbs and candle wax. The rhythm of daily life has been upended, shops shuttered, church bells ringing at odd hours, familiar faces absent from their usual places. In the wake of a plague, time seems to move differently, marked not by festivals or harvests, but by warnings, prayers, and the quiet tally of losses. As the epidemic moves through the city, every layer of society is touched. Traditions are paused or altered. Even the most sacred rituals are adapted for safety or survival. Imagine the sound of hymns sung softly from behind closed doors, or new symbols appearing on doorways to mark those stricken or recovered. Art, once filled with scenes of celebration, shifts towards somber images, skulls, wilting flowers, and candles burning low. The scent of incense in cathedrals is sharper, the colors of murals darker. Religious beliefs shift, sometimes deepening, sometimes fracturing. People search for meaning or comfort, new sects arise, and old authorities are questioned. Power structures, too, can change. Vacant offices are filled by survivors, laws rewritten to suit the needs of the moment. Some find opportunity in the chaos rising from obscurity. Others, unable to adapt, fade quietly from history. And always, a new culture emerges. Customs around mourning, cleanliness, and kinship evolve. Who is allowed to work, travel, or even speak in public may change. When the town square fills again, it is with a different rhythm, one shaped by memory and loss, but also by the silent determination to continue. The echoes of the plague linger, subtly rewriting what it means to belong, to survive, and to hope. Imagine yourself in a crowded hall, the air thick with suspicion you can almost taste. Centuries ago, it might have been a witch trial, neighbors whispering, eyes darting, a single accusation enough to set the flames. In the rhythm of those lives, fear spread faster than any plague. People clutched rosaries, swore they saw shadows, convinced themselves that evil wore familiar faces. Now, the setting has changed, but the pattern endures. Imagine a glowing screen instead of a torch-lit courtroom. One rumor grows into a chorus of outrage. Names are shared, judgments passed in minutes. The old hysteria finds new forms, online mobs instead of village gatherings, viral posts instead of shouted confessions. Still, the impulse is the same. Fear seeks a target. Uncertainty demands blame. By the time facts emerge, the damage is already woven into countless minds. It is easier to believe the first frightening story than to question it later. The cycle continues, quiet and relentless, feeding on the need to belong and the terror of being alone in doubt. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet archive, the air cool and still. A clerk slowly turns the pages of an old constitution, the edges softened by countless hands. At first glance, the words seem unchanged, lines declaring rights and freedoms in careful ink. But if you look closely, you notice small edits, a phrase narrowed by a footnote, a sentence adjusted by a new interpretation. Throughout history, rights have rarely vanished in sudden flames. Instead, they fade through slow, careful revisions. One law is amended to close a loophole. Another is redefined to suit the needs of those in power. The changes appear minor, almost harmless, as if nothing important has shifted. But over time, each adjustment quietly erodes what was once clear. Consider how guarantees of free speech have been narrowed by exceptions, or how protections of privacy have been softened by new technologies. In courtrooms and committees, language is weighed and reshaped until it no longer shields the people it was meant to protect. No proclamations announce the loss. No crowds gather to witness the moment a promise becomes an empty phrase. If you listen carefully, you can hear the quiet rhythm of this process, the slow turning of pages, the measured voices debating each word. It is not dramatic, but it is relentless. And in that steady drift, you sense how easy it is to forget what the text once meant, until one day, the rites that seemed permanent are little more than polite memories. Imagine yourself walking along a broad avenue lined with statues. Each figure carved in stone once represented something revered, a founder, a victory, a promise of progress. The faces look down with expressions that seem serene, untouched by time. Yet beneath this calm facade, history is always shifting. As seasons change, so do the meanings we attach to these silent monuments. What was once a marker of unity can, in a single generation, become a target of resentment. In the hush before dawn, you might see figures moving through the square, hoods drawn over their heads, ropes looped around outstretched arms of bronze. A statue topples slowly, striking the ground with a hollow finality. Cheers rise, not always from anger, sometimes simply from relief. The act feels necessary, though few can fully explain why. For a moment, the destruction seems to cleanse the air, as if by removing the symbol, the past itself has been put to rest. But memory is not so easily erased. Imagine the fragments of marble and iron left behind. Children pick them up, wondering who the statue once was. Elders tell stories colored by their own loyalties. Each shard becomes a clue to a history that refuses to stay buried. Over time, the absence of the symbol begins to hold as much power as its presence once did. The empty pedestal becomes a kind of question, one that each generation must answer for itself. As you drift toward sleep, consider how often people burn their own icons before they understand them. Flags are torn down, paintings defaced, monuments shattered into pieces that still glint with meaning. In every era, symbols become firewood, fuel for a moment's fervor. And yet, like embers, they remain, waiting quietly to catch light again in the minds of those who come after. Imagine yourself walking along a quiet road at dawn. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and smoke drifting from distant chimneys. You pass a field where workers bend low, their movements slow and methodical. No chains clink against their ankles. No overseer holds a whip. Yet if you pause to look closer, you'll sense another kind of weight pressing down, a burden less visible but no less binding. In the past, slavery declared itself openly. In markets, people were measured and sold. In records, they were listed beside livestock and grain. But over time, the language changed. Chains gave way to contracts. Ownership became debt. The power to command became the power to withhold. Imagine a scribe in a candlelit chamber recording agreements in careful lines of ink. A farmer pledges future harvests to repay a loan. A craftsman signs away years of labor to settle a tax. Each document appears ordinary, the transactions polite. Yet beneath the formal words is the same reality. A life constrained, choices stripped away, hours claimed by someone else. In medieval Europe, serfs could not leave their lord's land without permission. In industrial cities, factory workers lived in company housing, paid in tokens they could only spend at the company store. Today, you can see echoes in the relentless demands of debt, the quiet fear of losing a wage, the pressure to comply without question. Picture yourself standing among these stories. The forms shift, bonds of iron replaced by bonds of obligation. The names evolve, softened by the language of necessity and progress. But the rhythm is familiar. Work without freedom, effort without hope of escape. You can almost feel the weight in the air, an inheritance passed quietly from age to age. No proclamations announce its return. It simply arrives under different names, settling over the same weary shoulders. Imagine yourself walking along the crumbling stones of an old city wall at dawn, the cool air still and silent. Moss grows in the cracks, birds perch where guards once stood, and you can almost feel the weight of stories layered within the stones. Once, this barrier divided worlds, protecting some, excluding others. In the quiet, you might sense the relief that came when the wall finally fell, when neighbors could visit freely and long-separated families found each other again. The rhythm of daily life shifted, opening to possibility. But as years pass, unease quietly returns. Fears gather, sometimes from distant threats, sometimes from the uncertainty that follows peace. You hear it in careful conversations at market stalls, see it in cautious glances between strangers. The memory of old dangers lingers, shaping how people move and whom they trust. There is comfort in boundaries, even as they limit. Bit by bit, the impulse to protect, to separate, resurfaces. Soon, new walls begin to rise, sometimes of stone, sometimes of law or custom. You might notice gates closing earlier, guards returning, and old pathways quietly vanishing. The rhythm of the city grows contained, routines narrowing like well-worn paths through a field. The promise that never again would a barrier stand slowly fades, replaced by the certainty that safety is worth any price. Over generations, this cycle repeats. Walls fall, then are rebuilt, each time reshaped by new fears and old memories. The stones may change, but the pattern persists, an echo of the human desire for security and the cost it extracts from freedom. And so, as you walk beneath the rising shadow of another wall, you realize the barrier is never truly gone. It waits, quietly, to be rebuilt whenever fear returns. Imagine yourself in a silent library where the shelves lean under the weight of heavy volumes. The air is cool, thick with the scent of old leather and ink. Here, history waits to be rearranged. In one corner, a chronicler sharpens his quill, ready to soften yesterday's cruelty with careful words. The rhythm of this work is patient. Over time, brutal conquests become triumphant campaigns. The men who ordered massacres are recast as visionaries. Even their darkest choices are reframed as sacrifices for some greater good. Imagine a young scholar, generations later, reading these revised accounts. She feels a quiet awe instead of horror. In her mind, the past seems cleaner, more purposeful. This is how old crimes are wrapped in new language, how invasions become necessary expansions, how oppression becomes order. Each generation edits the record, sometimes out of pride, sometimes out of shame. And so the villains slip into the roles of patriots, their deeds polished by time and repetition. In this way, the truth becomes a shifting shape, easier to admire than to confront. Imagine yourself standing in an empty city square just after sunrise. The buildings are whole, the streets unscarred, but the air feels heavy in a way you can't quite name. No bombs have fallen here, yet everyone walks carefully, their voices lowered, as if any word might be overheard. This is the quiet tension that follows open conflict, the long shadow of fear that outlasts the fire. Throughout history, wars have often ended with treaties and ceremonies, but the suspicion they create lingers much longer. After the final explosions fade, nations keep watchful eyes on each other, building alliances and stockpiling weapons they hope never to use. Invisible lines are drawn across maps, separating allies from rivals, even when no bullets fly. Consider the decades after the Second World War, when the Cold War settled over much of the globe. There were no front lines in the traditional sense. Instead, there were hidden networks of spies, careful propaganda, and a quiet race to claim advantage. Children learned to practice drills beneath their desks. Ordinary people weighed each sentence, aware that a careless remark could invite suspicion. If you pause to listen, you can still hear the hum of that unease in archives and memoirs. The fear was not always loud, but it was steady, woven into daily life like an unwelcome refrain. And long after the treaties were signed, that same wariness remained, because even when the fire goes out, the memory of heat lingers, reminding everyone how quickly it can return. Imagine yourself in a quiet archive where the air smells of old paper and rain-soaked stone. Shelves are lined with records few people ever request, ledgers of names that vanished, reports stamped confidential, photographs that no longer have captions. When you run your hand along the spines of these forgotten accounts, you can almost feel the weight of what they hold. Each page is a fragment of something that once scorched the world, a massacre carried out in the hush of dawn, a community erased without witness, an atrocity recorded only in whispers. Over time, these records slip from public memory. The survivors grow old, their voices softer with each retelling. New generations inherit stories in fragments, half-remembered warnings, cautious silences around dinner tables, and slowly, the outlines of what really happened begin to blur. The world moves on, believing that time alone has healed the wound. Yet in that forgetting, something dangerous takes root. Imagine a future leader paging through those same archives, studying the methods and mistakes, the denials, the justifications, the carefully constructed illusions that allowed neighbors to look away. The blueprint is still there, waiting for someone to trace its lines. The mechanics of cruelty are simple to replicate once no one remembers how they unfolded. In the soft light of evening, consider how the absence of memory can become a kind of permission. When no monuments are built, when no lessons are taught, the past becomes pliable, easier to shape into something convenient or false. And in that silence, each forgotten atrocity leaves behind more than sorrow. It offers a quiet instruction for how such horrors can be repeated. As you prepare to rest, imagine the archives waiting in the dark, shelves upon shelves of neglected evidence, and consider how the most effective way to ensure history repeats is to let it be hidden, unspoken, and eventually denied. Imagine yourself in a stone sanctuary at dawn. Shafts of pale light fall across worn pews and carved altars. The air smells of old wood and candle smoke, carrying a hush that feels almost tender. On the walls, you see verses etched in delicate script, words about mercy, compassion, forgiveness. Yet you know that these same words have been carried beyond these walls, reshaped into reasons for conquest. In every era, faith has offered comfort and purpose. But it has also been used to justify harm, to rally armies, to silence doubt. You can almost hear the voices rising in a courtyard beyond the sanctuary, declaring that sacred duty demands the taking of land or the punishment of unbelievers. In medieval Europe, banners embroidered with holy symbols led men into battle. Priests blessed swords before sieges began. In their sermons, peaceful texts were recited with new urgency, each phrase recast as proof that violence was righteous. When cities fell, the same names invoked for healing were cried out amid ruin. Imagine a scribe in a candlelit cell, copying the same scriptures by hand. He pauses, hearing distant shouts, soldiers demanding loyalty in the name of the divine. He returns to his work, tracing each word carefully, as if precision could protect the meaning from distortion. This pattern repeats across centuries. In empires and republics alike, leaders have learned to weave faith into the fabric of command. A holy phrase can inspire courage or fear. It can comfort the suffering or brand them as enemies. Picture yourself standing at the threshold, listening as the same verses are spoken by gentle voices and then shouted in fury. The contrast is stark but familiar. Peaceful words do not vanish. They simply become tools in new hands. The rhythm of devotion continues, soft and insistent, even as its echoes turn harsh. Sacred names endure, pulled again and again through the same long corridors of history, sometimes as blessings, sometimes as weapons. Imagine yourself watching a line of travelers move quietly along a dusty road at dusk, bundles carried on weary shoulders, the shapes of families silhouetted against the fading light. The rhythm of their steps echoes across centuries, paths carved by hope, necessity, and loss. Each face tells a story both personal and familiar, leaving behind fields, homes, or cities now claimed by war, disaster, or new rulers. The air is thick with dust, and sometimes with the scent of unfamiliar herbs tied into their meager belongings. reminders of lives left behind. Along the route, the landscape offers both memory and indifference. Old border stones stand beside new fence, guards in new uniforms echoing the orders once barked by others. Rivers and forests mark passages familiar to generations of refugees before. If you listen closely, you might hear the same lullabies whispered at campfires, or see the same hopeful gestures as families glimpse a distant city on the horizon. The rhythm of daily life is reduced to survival, rationing bread, tending to children, resting wherever shelter can be found. Though the lines on the map change, empires rise and fall, borders shift, this journey repeats. Authorities ask the same questions, issue the same warnings, sometimes offer the same sparse kindness or cold refusal. The suffering is remarkably constant, shaped by timeless fears and fragile hopes. Each wave of refugees leaves behind traces, worn paths, names carved into tree trunks, the faded outlines of temporary camps swallowed by time. Over and over, desperate feet follow ancient footprints, their stories both unique and heartbreakingly familiar. And as the world changes around them, the journey endures, a quiet thread running through history, marking the persistence of hope and the repeating cycle of loss and belonging. Imagine yourself in a grand hall where banners hang from polished balconies and the floor hums with anxious conversation. Rows of citizens wait their turn to drop folded ballots into wooden boxes. The atmosphere feels hopeful, almost ceremonial. But beneath this ritual, fear coils quietly. The rhythm of democracy can be comforting, its motions familiar. Yet history shows how easily it becomes a stage for something darker. In times of crisis, war, famine, plague, people crave certainty more than freedom. Imagine a leader promising safety, vowing to purge enemies and restore order. The crowd applauds, relieved to hear simple answers. They do not notice the fine print, that each new law narrows the space for dissent. Over time, rights are bartered away in the name of security. The right to speak, to assemble, to question. These freedoms slip out of reach, piece by piece. When the final votes are counted, the applause grows quieter. Some sense what they have lost, but the momentum feels unstoppable. Democracy, unguarded by vigilance, becomes a soft disguise for control, and the ballots that once promised liberty now seal its absence. Imagine yourself in a grand hall where banners hang from polished balconies and the floor hums with anxious conversation. Rows of citizens wait their turn to drop folded ballots into wooden boxes. The atmosphere feels hopeful, almost ceremonial. But beneath this ritual, fear coils quietly. The rhythm of democracy can be comforting, its motions familiar. Yet history shows how easily it becomes a stage for something darker. In times of crisis, war, famine, plague, people crave certainty more than freedom. Imagine a leader promising safety, vowing to purge enemies and restore order. The crowd applauds, relieved to hear simple answers. They do not notice the fine print, that each new law narrows the space for dissent. Over time, rights are bartered away in the name of security. The right to speak, to assemble, to question. These freedoms slip out of reach, piece by piece. When the final votes are counted, the applause grows quieter. Some sense what they have lost, but the momentum feels unstoppable. Democracy, unguarded by vigilance, becomes a soft disguise for control, and the ballots that once promised liberty now seal its absence. Imagine yourself in a crowded square as dusk begins to settle. Lanterns flicker to life one by one, casting gentle circles of light over faces turned expectantly toward a wooden platform. A speaker climbs the steps, their voice carrying just enough conviction to feel soothing. As you listen, you notice the subtle sway of the crowd, a rhythm that grows with each sentence. The words are simple, familiar, yet charged with something that feels electric. You feel it too, though you cannot say exactly why. In these moments, a peculiar warmth spreads through the gathering. Neighbors who were cautious hours before now nod in unison. Doubts that once lingered quietly in the mind dissolve in the comfort of collective belief. This is how madness begins, not in sudden violence, but in the steady repetition of an idea that grows harder to question the more it is shared. Each voice adds weight to the next, until silence itself feels like betrayal. Imagine how swiftly this contagion travels. A rumor whispered in the dark becomes a headline by morning. An accusation with no proof blooms into certainty when repeated often enough. Over time, people begin to perform the rituals of agreement, reciting the same phrases, displaying the same symbols, offering the same rehearsed outrage. It feels safer to belong, even when reason has been left behind. As you stand at the edge of the square, you might sense a flicker of unease, a reminder that truth often moves slowly, cautious and deliberate, while delusion rushes ahead like fire on dry grass. By the time the flames are visible, the damage is already done. As you settle into rest, consider how mass psychosis is not a rare phenomenon, but a pattern older than memory. It thrives on the instinct to trust the familiar voice, to join the chorus rather than question it. And in that impulse, crowds are bound together not only by hope or fear, but by a shared willingness to abandon what they once knew was true. Imagine yourself in a quiet library filled with rows of neatly labeled volumes. The air smells faintly of old paper and polished wood. On a heavy oak table lie pamphlets from a century ago, their titles declaring visions of progress and health. If you read carefully, you see the same ideas repeated. The belief that some lives are worth more, that perfection can be measured, that humanity should be improved by deliberate selection. Eugenics was once spoken aloud with pride. In lecture halls and government offices, officials praised it as modern science. Policies emerged, sterilization laws, marriage restrictions, careful records of lineage. The language was clinical, almost soothing. Improvement, purity, efficiency. Yet behind the gentle words lay something older and harsher, the conviction that some people must be erased for others to flourish. Imagine a clerk seated at a broad desk, recording the names of families deemed unfit. He works in silence, the scratch of his pen steady, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit what his lists will become. After the horrors of the 20th century, these ideas seemed discredited. Public condemnation grew. The word eugenics fell out of use. But you can see how the same ideology reappears, cloaked in new vocabulary. Genetic fitness, optimization, screening. The promise remains the same, to perfect the human story by deciding who belongs. Picture a modern laboratory, bright and clean, with instruments humming softly. A researcher examines strands of DNA, describing potential and risk in measured tones. The language is precise, confident. Yet if you listen closely, you'll hear echoes of that old ambition, to rank, to exclude, to cleanse. Imagine yourself standing among these shelves of records and reports. Each generation believes it has transcended the past, that it has learned enough to avoid old mistakes. But the rhythm of eugenics persists, buried, renamed, and quietly returned. The conviction that humanity can be purified waits patiently, ready to surface again. Imagine yourself in a quiet clinic at the edge of a city, the smell of antiseptic mingling with the faint metallic scent of old instruments. The walls are lined with charts and faded photographs, each a promise of healing and care. In the rhythm of daily life, medicine arrives with hope, a bandage, a gentle touch, a whispered assurance that suffering can be eased. Yet, beneath these good intentions, history reveals a more unsettling pattern. At times, the very tools meant for comfort have been turned into instruments of power. Imagine patients gathered in waiting rooms, some uncertain, some trusting, unaware of the policies or decisions being made behind closed doors. In many places, certain groups have found themselves subjected to procedures they did not choose, forced sterilizations justified as progress, or experiments conducted without consent, cloaked in the language of science and necessity. You might recall stories from distant wars where medicine was used not to heal, but to harm. Treatments denied to some, or deliberately twisted to weaken and control. In other eras, treatments were withheld from the poor or the marginalized, their suffering explained away as inevitable or even deserved. The rhythm of care was replaced by a rhythm of control, the hospital or laboratory becoming a place of quiet dread rather than comfort. Over generations, these stories accumulate, quietly shaping trust and fear in equal measure. Communities remember which doors were closed to them, which remedies came with a price, which doctors asked questions that felt like accusations. Even as medicine continues to advance, the shadow of its misuse lingers, a reminder that healing can become a weapon when guided by prejudice or power, and that true care must always reckon with the lessons of its past. Imagine yourself in a city where the clocks have all been reset. Calendars hang in shop windows, but the familiar dates are gone, replaced by numbers that honor a single ruler's rise. The rhythm of daily life shifts, holidays vanish, anniversaries are banned. In this new order, time itself becomes a tool of power. Dictators have always understood this. They erase photographs, censor archives, and rename entire decades to suit their story. Imagine a family searching for an old wedding picture only to find it blurred or missing. The past, once solid, becomes uncertain. In Stalin's Russia, officials vanished not just from life, but from history books. Their names were scraped from records, their faces painted out of group portraits. Over years, collective memory softens around these absences until forgetting feels natural. This is how control spreads, quietly, through the simple act of unmarking a year or silencing a name. When time is rewritten, the present becomes easier to rule, and the people, deprived of their own history, no longer know exactly what they have lost. Imagine yourself standing in a quiet square just after a revolution. The banners of the old regime have been pulled down, their emblems burned or hidden away. For a moment, there is relief in the air, a sense that something heavy has finally lifted. But as the days pass, the rhythm of life does not return to calm. Instead, new decrees are posted on the walls, and crowds gather to watch trials that seem less like justice and more like spectacle. Throughout history, the fall of one power often brings the rise of another that promises fairness. Leaders stand before the people and vow to right old wrongs, but soon the desire to punish grows larger than the promise to rebuild. Enemies are named swiftly. Accusations spread easily. Where courts once measured evidence carefully, they now hurry to deliver sentences that satisfy public anger. Consider the revolutions in France, when the symbols of monarchy were torn down and replaced with ideals of equality. What followed was not only reform, but the reign of terror, executions carried out in the name of virtue. Neighbors turned on neighbors. In the same squares where kings were condemned, ordinary citizens met the blade. The sword, it seemed, swung both ways without pause. If you look closely, you'll see this pattern repeating, a promise of justice that transforms into vengeance, slowly at first, then all at once. In that shift, you can sense how easily the desire to heal becomes the urge to hurt, how quickly the hope for a fair world can be swallowed by fear and revenge. Imagine yourself walking down a familiar street at dawn. The shop signs creak softly in the morning breeze, and the windows glow with the first light of day. You notice the small cameras perched on rooftops and lampposts, their lenses blinking with quiet attention. At first, their presence feels harmless, even comforting. They were installed, you're told, to keep everyone safe, to watch over the neighborhood so no harm could slip through unseen. In the early days, most people welcome this promise. It feels like a reasonable exchange, a little less privacy in return for the reassurance that danger will be caught before it can unfold. Officials issue gentle statements reminding you that good citizens have nothing to fear. The cameras are simply there to protect. The ritual of observation begins so subtly that you scarcely notice its expansion. New sensors at the corners of public squares, microphones hidden along the covered arcades, data quietly cataloged and stored. Over time, you realize the definition of safety has started to shift. Small infractions, once overlooked, are now documented in meticulous detail. A neighbor's harmless complaint becomes a file. A casual remark becomes evidence. Suspicion grows in places where trust once flourished. The same tools that were meant to guard against violence begin to trace the outlines of every private life. Imagine yourself pausing beneath one of these cameras. You feel the quiet pressure of being seen, of every action recorded, just in case it might be misunderstood. The promise of safety has evolved into an unspoken demand for conformity, and in that watchful silence, a new kind of power takes root, one that no longer needs to justify itself at all. As you prepare for rest, consider how surveillance is always justified first with the language of care. It enters as protection and lingers as control. And, in that subtle transition, the lines between security and suspicion are erased, one quiet recording at a time. Imagine yourself in a crowded square at dusk, lanterns flickering against the walls of tall buildings. Notices hang from wooden boards, their ink still fresh, warning citizens of a dangerous group gathering beyond the city's edge. You read the names carefully, but the language feels familiar, almost rehearsed. The same phrases appeared in older proclamations: threats to order, corruption of morals, hidden alliances. If you listen closely to the murmurs in the crowd, you'll hear the same old fear wearing a new mask. The targets change: outsiders, heretics, revolutionaries, but the pattern repeats. We are told to watch our neighbors, to distrust strangers, to see danger in faces that resemble the same faces named as enemies decades before. In medieval towns, suspicion often turned to entire communities. Merchants blamed for plagues, minorities accused of conspiracy, small sects labeled as traitors. Their clothes, their languages, their rituals made them easy to mark. Over time, these accusations became tradition, passed from generation to generation like an inheritance no one questioned. Imagine a scribe sitting by candlelight, copying decrees that list the supposed threats. He has copied similar words before, though the names were different. His pen moves in the same slow rhythm, the ink drying on parchment that will be read with alarm. You can picture it happening again in more modern times. Political pamphlets warning of infiltration, newsreels naming new adversaries. The slogans shift, the uniforms change, but the fear remains steady. Each time, the promise is the same: if only this enemy is defeated, peace will return. Imagine yourself standing in that square, feeling the familiar tension rising in the air. You might notice how quickly a stranger becomes an adversary when enough voices repeat the accusation. The rhythm of suspicion is patient. It waits for a moment of uncertainty, then wraps itself in the names of old fears and steps back into the light. Imagine yourself standing near a quiet plaza, the night air tinged with the faint aroma of smoke and old paper. Around you, the remains of charred pages drift across cobblestones, remnants of stories, histories, and questions now erased. The rhythm of daily life has paused for a moment, neighbors gathered in uneasy silence watching the flames. In every era, books have been more than mere objects. They are vessels for memory, challenge, and hope. Yet, fear finds its mark in these fragile pages. When rulers or authorities feel threatened by ideas, by voices that question, contradict, or imagine something new, the first response is often destruction. You might picture scholars hurriedly copying manuscripts by candlelight, or parents hiding banned volumes beneath loose floorboards. In monasteries, libraries, and humble homes, people have risked much to preserve the written word, sensing its power to outlast violence. The fire itself becomes a symbol, knowledge treated as dangerous, curiosity punished, diversity of thought forced into silence. Imagine the scent of ink and parchment turned bitter by flame, the gentle hush as stories disappear. In the aftermath, people may return to their routines, but something subtle shifts. The rhythm of inquiry is dulled, and the comfort of sharing ideas is tinged with caution. Still, even as books burn, their influence persists. Words survive in memory, whispered from teacher to student, or etched into new forms. Over centuries, this cycle repeats, fear igniting the fires, hope rebuilding what was lost. In every region and every age, the lesson lingers. The hunger to control thought is as old as the desire to express it. And in that quiet struggle, stories somehow endure. Imagine yourself in a dim gallery where canvases hang under sheets of cloth. A hush settles over the space, thick with the sense that something precious is being hidden. You lift a corner of the fabric and glimpse a painting that shows too much. Poverty no one wants to see, cruelty no one dares to name. This is the rhythm of censorship. When art approaches the heart of what is true, it becomes dangerous. In empires and republics alike, the most carefully crafted poems, songs, and plays have often been the first to be banned. Imagine a poet whose verses whisper about injustice. The words spread quietly, folded into letters, or murmured at kitchen tables. The authorities respond not with argument, but with silence and erasure. A play is shut down before opening night. A novel disappears from shelves. Yet the power of the work lingers. What frightens a regime is not simply beauty, but the clarity that art can bring, a mirror held to power, reflecting every crack. The more honest the vision, the more swiftly it must be hidden. Imagine yourself in a quiet room lit by the soft glow of a single lamp. A file sits open on the table, filled with notes about where you've been, what you've purchased, and whom you've spoken to. Nothing in it is dramatic, just small details collected over time. Yet together, they form a picture more complete than any stranger should hold. Throughout history, people have traded privacy for the feeling of safety. A new threat appears, and laws are quickly written to track movements, gather information, and watch for signs of danger. At first, the measures seem temporary, a necessary sacrifice to keep harm away, but as months pass, the surveillance becomes ordinary. Cameras stay mounted on walls, records remain stored in hidden archives. Consider the way identification papers once reserved for wartime slowly became standard in peacetime, or how phone calls, once considered private, grew easier to monitor. Each step was justified, each intrusion explained as a shield. But the shield never disappears, and the rights it replaces seldom return in full. If you pause to listen, you can hear the quiet rhythm of this exchange. A little more data offered, a little more freedom surrendered. It happens so gradually that it feels harmless, almost invisible. Yet over time, the trade becomes permanent. And in that steady drift, you sense how easily the promise of protection can overshadow the need to be left alone. Imagine yourself in a grand hall lit by dozens of low-burning lamps. Their glow softens every face, casting a golden hush over the crowd. At the far end, a figure stands with a smile so warm it seems to draw everyone closer. Their voice carries across the chamber, smooth, reassuring, touched by just enough humility to feel genuine. You watch as people lean forward, captivated by the promise that everything difficult will soon be made simple. In history, the most dangerous figures rarely arrived with threats or thunderous speeches. They came gently, offering small kindnesses and generous words. A hand placed lightly on a shoulder, a pledge to lift burdens, a talent for making each listener feel uniquely seen. The poison, when it came, did not taste bitter. It was mixed into sweet assurances that no sacrifice would ever be too great if it served the common good. Imagine how easy it is to be charmed. The rhythms of daily life, work, conversation, quiet evenings, are interrupted by the thrill of being led by someone who seems destined to heal every fracture. People begin to repeat their words without realizing it. Families gather in kitchens and parlors, quoting lines from speeches as if they were old proverbs. Each repetition reinforces the illusion that this leader is different, that this time the power will be used wisely. Over time, the boundaries shift. The demands grow. What was once voluntary becomes expected, and still, the smile remains, as constant as the sun rising over the city's rooftops. By the time the harm is visible, Most have already invested their faith so deeply that to withdraw it feels like betrayal. As you prepare for sleep, consider how often tyranny wears a kindly face. The leaders who charm are the ones who leave the deepest marks. In their presence, suspicion seems rude, doubt feels ungrateful. And in that gentle atmosphere, the poison spreads, quiet, invisible, and more complete than any threat could ever be. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow corridor lined with iron doors. The air feels heavy, thick, with the scent of damp stone and old paper. A lantern flickers overhead, casting soft shadows across numbered cells. From behind the doors, you hear almost nothing, a hush so complete it feels deliberate. This is how prisons fill. Not all at once, not with spectacle, but with steady increments. A new law to manage unrest, an ordinance to deter disorder, a rule meant to protect public safety. Each measure arrives with calm assurances, explained in careful language. Outside, life continues much the same. Markets open, children play, and neighbors greet each other politely. Few notice how many disappear into these quiet halls. In ancient empires, dissenters were confined not because their ideas were dangerous in themselves, but because too many questions could disturb the calm of authority. Over time, small courts and local judges began to send more people away. A scribe who copied forbidden texts, a farmer who could not pay a debt, a woman who spoke too sharply in the wrong assembly. Imagine a clerk seated at a desk near the entrance, recording names in a thick ledger. His pen moves slowly, line by line. At first, he believes each sentence is justified, but as the pages fill, he pauses. The names are familiar. People he passed in the square, neighbors whose children once played near his own. You can see this pattern echo through modern history. Prisons expanding behind high walls. Policies announced in measured tones, promising safety and order. Meanwhile, the cells grow crowded. Those inside are forgotten, or mentioned only in passing, statistics rather than voices. Picture yourself pausing in that corridor, listening to the stillness pressing in from every side. Outside, the streets remain quiet, almost peaceful. Yet this silence does not mean justice has triumphed. It means the voices of the absent no longer reach beyond the locked doors. Imagine yourself in a city just as dusk settles, the streets lit by lanterns and the quiet buzz of conversation. Notices appear on doorways, small, official, easy to overlook at first. A single ban is announced, perhaps on a book, a song, or a gathering. The rhythm of daily life barely stirs. People adjust, some grumble softly, most simply comply. The reasoning is always familiar: safety, order, the greater good. And yet, a subtle shift takes root in the city's atmosphere. With time, the first restriction is followed by another, and then another. What began as an exception becomes routine, and the list of forbidden things quietly grows. Markets lose their music, certain colors or symbols vanish from windows, conversations turn cautious and circumspect. You might sense the slow tightening of ordinary life, the careful avoidance of once innocent topics, the hush that settles over old jokes or familiar songs. Each ban is explained as necessary, yet each one narrows the world a little more. In homes and workshops, people recall what was once allowed and wonder what will disappear next. Stories are shared in whispers about earlier times, about neighbors who moved away, or old festivities that can no longer be named. The rhythm of community shifts, losing its ease and color, replaced by a steady, invisible pressure. Once the habit of banning is accepted, it rarely stops with a single act. Boundaries, once drawn, have a way of expanding. Over years, the city may hardly resemble the place it was. Yet beneath the new rules, memories persist, of songs unsung, ideas unspoken, choices slowly narrowed by the logic of fear. And so, bans spread, one after another, shaping not just what is forbidden, but the very spirit of daily life. Imagine yourself standing by a long, gleaming line of train cars as dawn creeps over the tracks. The iron wheels rest silent, but you can sense their purpose. For many, trains have promised progress, fresh bread arriving in distant towns, letters bridging whole continents. This is the rhythm of industry, measured, efficient, always on time. Yet beneath that promise runs another story. In war, these same cars carried soldiers toward trenches. In hidden compartments, they transported weapons and stolen art. Imagine a station where families with small bundles waited under armed guard, watching as their names were checked off ledgers. The trains that once delivered prosperity became instruments of removal, each departure another quiet erasure. During the Holocaust, timetables ran with chilling precision, each number representing lives uprooted. Even in peace, trains have carried forced laborers or exiled communities to faraway settlements. The steel rails do not choose their cargo. They serve whatever purpose power demands, linking hope and catastrophe along the same cold track. Imagine yourself standing by a long, gleaming line of train cars as dawn creeps over the tracks. The iron wheels rest silent, but you can sense their purpose. For many, trains have promised progress, fresh bread arriving in distant towns, letters bridging whole continents. This is the rhythm of industry, measured, efficient, always on time. Yet beneath that promise runs another story. In war, these same cars carried soldiers toward trenches. In hidden compartments, they transported weapons and stolen art. Imagine a station where families with small bundles waited under armed guard, watching as their names were checked off ledgers. The trains that once delivered prosperity became instruments of removal, each departure another quiet erasure. During the Holocaust, timetables ran with chilling precision, each number representing lives uprooted. Even in peace, trains have carried forced laborers or exiled communities to faraway settlements. The steel rails do not choose their cargo. They serve whatever purpose power demands, linking hope and catastrophe along the same cold track. Imagine yourself in a small house as dusk settles over narrow streets. Through a thin wall, you can hear the muffled voices of neighbors sharing their worries in low tones. The air smells faintly of smoke and damp wood. In this quiet, you might believe trust is unshakable. But history shows that loyalty often bends under fear or temptation. In every era, informants have lived among ordinary people. A friend, a colleague, even a relative, someone trusted enough to be welcomed close. When authorities come asking questions, that trust can break. Sometimes it happens under threat, a promise that silence will bring punishment. Other times, it happens for reward, money, favor, or the simple relief of being on the safer side. Consider the records kept in secret police archives across centuries. They are filled with familiar names, those who agreed to share what they overheard. A whispered remark, a hidden letter, a private complaint, all gathered and delivered to officials who rarely questioned the motives behind them. If you look closely, you'll see how this pattern repeats again and again. During wars, during revolutions, even in times that feel peaceful, information becomes currency, and silence, though praised as noble, is rarer than it seems. In that realization, there is no need for alarm, only a quiet understanding that human nature does not change quickly. The walls are thinner than they appear, and in the spaces between each conversation, the possibility of betrayal is always waiting. Imagine yourself in a small library tucked behind a row of shuttered shops. The air smells of old bindings and the faint trace of rain drifting through the cracks. Along the shelves sit dozens of accounts of the same event, each one a little different, each insisting it holds the real truth. A quiet confusion settles over the room as you leaf through the pages. The more you read, the less certain you become. And in that uncertainty, a peculiar hunger grows, the need for a story that feels complete. When governments refuse to speak plainly, silence itself becomes an invitation. People gather in kitchens, in dim corners of public squares, piecing together fragments and rumors. A vanished official becomes a martyr. An unexplained disaster turns into a deliberate plot. Myths collect around the gaps in the record, filling every space where truth might have stood. The stories spread because they offer something official statements never do: a sense of certainty. Imagine the slow evolution of these tales. What begins as a question, why did this happen? Who was responsible? Gradually hardens into belief. Symbols emerge to mark allegiance. Slogans replace conversation. Over time, even those who once doubted begin to repeat the same phrases, if only to avoid the unease of not knowing. The puzzle becomes a kind of refuge, a narrative so compelling that it no longer matters whether it is real. In the quiet hours before dawn, the myths acquire a momentum all their own. They are taught to children as lessons, carved into monuments, whispered as warnings. And eventually, they shape the very memory of a generation. As you prepare for rest, consider how the absence of clear truth can be more dangerous than any single lie. When no one will speak with honesty, people invent their own explanations. In time, these inventions grow into something stronger than fact, a shared conviction, immune to evidence, sustained by the simple need to believe. Imagine yourself in a narrow room where rows of uniforms hang neatly on iron hooks. The fabric smells faintly of starch and old wool. Each jacket bears an insignia, symbols meant to inspire respect or fear. You run your hand across the smooth braid on a shoulder, feeling how an ordinary garment becomes something heavier once it is worn. When people step into these clothes, something shifts. A clerk becomes an enforcer. A neighbor becomes an overseer. The uniform speaks before the person does, announcing authority, demanding compliance. In this transformation, conscience can grow quiet. Orders echo louder than private doubts. In ancient Rome, centurions donned segmented armor that set them apart from any common soldier. Their red crests marked them as the embodiment of discipline, expected to carry out punishments without hesitation. In medieval courts, hooded executioners wore dark cloth to shield their identities, and perhaps to shield them from their own reflection. Imagine a tailor working by lamplight, stitching ranks and titles into each sleeve. He does not decide how the garments will be used. He only ensures they fit perfectly, that the emblems are precise. When the uniform is complete, the person who wears it may find an unexpected clarity, a sense that duty matters more than uncertainty, that belonging matters more than compassion. You can see this pattern in more recent history. Factory guards, soldiers, police, all drawn from ordinary homes, transformed by the promise of shared purpose. In a crowd, their voices merge. In a crisis, their judgment yields to command. Picture yourself standing in that quiet room as dawn begins to lighten the walls. One by one, the uniforms will be lifted from their hooks. The people who put them on will step out into the world with a different posture, a different gaze. The rhythm of their lives, once private and hesitant, will be replaced by the certainty of orders. And when it is over, they will fold the fabric carefully away, never quite able to explain how easily it gave them permission to do what once seemed unthinkable. Imagine yourself in a crowded tavern at dusk, the air thick with the scent of strong drink and sweet cakes. The clatter of mugs, the laughter, and raised voices all blend into the steady pulse of daily life. In every age, people have reached for small comforts, a warm cup, a pinch of sweetness, the promise of brief escape. Yet often, what feels like a simple pleasure is quietly shaped by powers beyond your reach. In colonial times, alcohol was not just a luxury, but a ration, distributed with wages to soldiers and workers, weaving dependence into the rhythm of survival. Later, governments and companies learned the power of habit, adding sugar to children's food, making cheap stimulants widely available, and designing products meant to keep hands reaching for more. You might notice how the craving grows so slowly that it becomes invisible. A morning cup of tea, an afternoon treat, a nightly drink, each ritual quietly reinforced by authority, profit, or policy. The streets of the city tell this story too. Bright advertisements promise energy or relief. Stores place temptations within easy reach. For many, these substances offer brief comfort from hardship, a balm for worry or fatigue. But beneath the surface, addiction is rarely a matter of simple choice. The rhythm of want and reward is carefully engineered, designed to keep people returning, spending, working, needing. Over generations, cravings are woven into culture, justified as tradition or necessity. The cost is measured not just in coins, but in health, in lost time, in patterns that shape entire communities. Empires have always understood that to keep people craving is to keep them controllable. And so, while daily pleasures may feel harmless, history gently reminds us that addiction is often crafted, not chosen, an inheritance passed quietly from age to age. Imagine yourself in a grand hall lined with polished wood and solemn flags. A leader steps up to a podium, voice smooth and measured, offering an apology for past injustices. The crowd listens, some with tears, others with folded arms. The air feels heavy with rehearsed sincerity. This is the rhythm of public contrition, statements crafted to soothe without unsettling the foundations beneath them. Over time, apologies become rituals, spoken when the evidence is undeniable, when the suffering can no longer be ignored. Imagine a report released decades too late, describing crimes committed behind locked doors. The institution pledges to reflect, to do better, but the structures that allowed the harm remain untouched. In this way, words become a currency cheaper than transformation. They buy time, soften outrage, and offer the illusion of progress. Each time history repeats, the same language returns: regret without restitution, promises without repair. And so, apologies pile up like brittle leaves, covering the same roots that keep growing in the dark. Imagine yourself in a quiet, candlelit room at the far end of a narrow street. The shutters are drawn, muffling the sounds from outside. On the table rests a single book, its cover plain and unmarked, its pages worn smooth by many careful hands. In this secret space, each word on the page is read with a special weight, a sense that you are glimpsing something others have tried to erase. Throughout history, the books most eagerly sought are often those forbidden by law, faith, or custom. The moment a title is banned, its value changes. Readers huddle over copies hidden in coat linings or tucked beneath floorboards, the scent of ink mingling with quiet anxiety. The forbidden becomes a symbol, not just of knowledge, but of resistance itself. Consider the centuries-old stories of banned texts, from philosophical treatises in ancient Greece to revolutionary pamphlets in Enlightenment Europe. In each era, censors have believed that by burning or banning a book, its influence could be erased. But the opposite usually happens. A burned book draws more attention. A censored page is copied and shared in whispers. The rhythm of daily life bends to accommodate these secret readings, gatherings behind closed doors, coded discussions in marketplaces, a community forming quietly around shared words. Even in modern times, the pattern remains. Titles removed from library shelves find new life online, passing from reader to reader with renewed energy. The very act of forbidding creates a special reverence, a sense that these words must be dangerous or precious. If you pause to consider it, you'll see how the forbidden is always more alluring. In the hush of a hidden room, each sentence is remembered longer, each idea discussed more intently, and the story of the book outlives every attempt to silence it. In that silent reverence, the power of the forbidden book grows, echoing through generations. Imagine yourself in a city where old churches and mosques stand side by side, their bells and calls echoing gently over tiled rooftops. For a time, daily life moves in peaceful rhythms, markets bustling, students reading aloud in courtyards, elders sharing quiet prayers at sunset. Faith weaves through the routines of the city, not as a force to fear, but as a kind of comfort, a shared language spoken in gestures and rituals. In these stretches of calm, it's easy to believe the world has finally learned to leave old battles behind. But across centuries, a different pattern emerges. In moments of uncertainty, when resources grow scarce or rulers seek to bind their people tighter, faith is pulled from the hearth and placed on the banner. Leaders step forward, speaking not just of the divine, but of enemies, threats, and destiny. The language of worship becomes the language of war. Crusades, whether by name or by spirit, return with a strange familiarity. People who once prayed together now face each other across lines drawn in dust and doctrine. Imagine the slow transformation. Prayers that once asked for peace become calls to action. Symbols once worn for comfort become emblems of division. In the shadows of cathedrals and mosques, the old words are given new urgency, sharpened by the promise of righteousness. Families find themselves repeating slogans that sound ancient, but have been quietly rewritten for this moment. As years pass, the cycle completes itself. The crusade, whatever its form, fades into memory, leaving scars and legends behind. And once more, daily life settles into quieter patterns. But the echo remains, lingering in the stories elders tell and in the architecture of cities rebuilt after conflict. As you drift towards sleep, consider how often faith, meant for solace, is drawn into the service of power. Crusades may change their names, but their rhythm endures, returning whenever those in command find it useful to turn prayers into weapons and belief into a march toward domination. Imagine yourself in a long hall draped with tapestries, the light filtered through high windows. The hush in the room feels almost sacred, but beneath it you sense an undercurrent, a quiet that has been arranged, not achieved. In the corners, officials sit at small tables, sliding parchments across polished wood, their voices a measured whisper. Gold coins pass from hand to hand. Promises are exchanged, warnings delivered in coded words. The silence you hear is not the result of deep healing, but of careful negotiation. Throughout history, the most peaceful moments are rarely spontaneous. A king ends a rebellion not by solving grievances, but by offering titles, lands, or payments to rival nobles. In the marketplace, merchants keep their disputes contained, not out of genuine goodwill, but because the city council offers leniency or veiled threats. Even in the family, a quarrel goes quiet because a secret is kept, or a debt is forgiven, for now. You can imagine a scribe recording the details of these agreements, careful not to write more than necessary. The official version will say, "Peace was restored," omitting the price paid to keep it. The streets outside may appear tranquil, with children playing in the dust, but those who know how to listen can hear the tension beneath the quiet. Everyone understands the boundaries, the words that must not be spoken. This pattern appears across centuries. Empires declare a new era of peace, but behind every proclamation are payments to rivals, threats against dissenters, deals that require continued silence. The cost of this quiet is rarely visible, yet it shapes the rhythm of daily life. Each soft moment rests on bargains, on secrets held just out of sight. Picture yourself in that hall as evening settles. The voices fade, the coins are counted, and a gentle silence returns. Yet you know this calm is fragile, sustained by deals rather than true forgiveness. The rhythm of their lives continues, measured not by healing, but by the weight of what must remain unspoken. Imagine yourself in a quiet council hall, where the flicker of candlelight casts long shadows on stone walls. The room is filled with the soft murmur of debate, the comfortable rhythm of familiar voices discussing problems and hopes. For years, questioning has been a mark of loyalty, suggestions offered with respect, disagreements voiced in careful tones. The daily life of the community depends on this trust, this sense that everyone seeks the common good. But then, something changes. A single question, perhaps about a new law or a recent decision, lingers a moment too long in the air. The atmosphere in the room shifts, subtle but unmistakable. Faces turn, eyes narrow. What was once seen as thoughtful is suddenly recast as dangerous or even subversive. The words order and stability take on new weight, and yesterday's valued advisor is quietly, then openly, marked as an outsider. In the days that follow, rumors begin to spread. The rhythm of daily life grows cautious. People choose their words carefully, avoiding topics that once seemed harmless. Old friendships are tested, alliances reshuffled. You might notice doors closed more tightly, or neighbors who once exchanged greetings now passing in silence. The boundary between acceptable dissent and forbidden disorder has moved overnight, with no warning and no appeal. Over time, the community adjusts, public discussion narrows, and those who remember freer conversations grow quieter. The distinction between loyal critique and betrayal is blurred by fear. What remains is a steady, uneasy order, maintained less by conviction than by silence. And so, history repeats this pattern. Voices that once strengthened the group become threats, and dissent, for a time, is redefined as disorder, reminding us how fragile trust and freedom can be when the rules suddenly change. Imagine yourself in a sterile room where the walls echo with quiet footsteps and whispered instructions. A child sits still, eyes wide, unaware that her reactions will shape discoveries far beyond this moment. This is the rhythm of exploitation masked as progress. Throughout history, those with the least power have become subjects of experiments, often without consent, sometimes without knowledge. In the 20th century, prisoners were given untested medicines under harsh conditions. Poor communities found themselves in medical trials, their struggles seen as opportunities for data rather than suffering. Imagine a crowded hospital ward where researchers record responses while families wait outside, hoping for cures but unsure of risks. The stories repeat. Vulnerable populations sacrificed on the altar of science. Though some studies have advanced knowledge, the moral cost is heavy and often ignored. This pattern reveals how power shapes not only who benefits, but who is used. When choice is stripped away, the powerless become tools for others' ambitions, caught in experiments that reflect the inequalities of the world beyond the laboratory walls. Imagine yourself sitting at a kitchen table, the morning paper spread before you, or a radio humming softly in the background. The stories seem ordinary, reports of distant conflicts, new laws, or daily events. The tone is measured, even reassuring. Yet, woven between the lines, subtle suggestions guide your attention and shape what you believe to be true. Throughout history, the most powerful propaganda rarely announces itself. Instead, it slips quietly into trusted news, adopting the language of facts and authority. Headlines offer certainty. Maps, charts, and expert interviews fill in details. But sometimes, what sounds like simple reporting is carefully designed to persuade, to redirect questions, or to plant doubt. Consider the broadcasts that shaped public opinion during world wars. Announcers described victories, explained losses, and presented the enemy in unflattering ways, all without raising their voices. The rhythm of ordinary life continued, but gradually, attitudes shifted. What once seemed complex became simple, nuance faded. Even in peaceful times, official statements blend with independent journalism until it's hard to tell one from the other. Photos are chosen to flatter or alarm. Stories are repeated, details omitted, language softened or sharpened depending on the desired effect. The line between information and influence blurs. If you pause to reflect, you'll see that the most effective lies are rarely dramatic. They are steady, familiar, and dressed in the clothing of the everyday. In that gentle flow of news, dangerous ideas find shelter, spreading not through force, but through trust. And so, the words that fill the quiet of your morning or the stillness of your evening can shape whole generations without ever raising suspicion. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a quiet schoolyard just as the sun begins to rise. The air is soft with the sounds of children's laughter, the shuffling of shoes, the bright music of a day about to begin. For a moment, Everything feels sheltered, innocence preserved within the safety of routine. Yet history's shadows are never far away. In times of conflict and upheaval, children are often the first to be swept up, their openness turned quietly, methodically, into a tool for those in power. Across centuries and continents, the pattern repeats. In isolated villages, cults gather their youngest and teach them a world narrowed to us versus them. In cities under siege, children march in parades, their small fists gripping banners heavier than they know. School lessons are rewritten, lullabies replaced with slogans. Childhood becomes rehearsal for a cause the children themselves cannot question. The familiar rituals of growing up are bent, one by one, toward a purpose chosen by others. Imagine the silent tension at home. Parents watching as new rules arrive from distant authorities, as stories their children repeat at the dinner table no longer sound quite their own. For many, the most profound loss is not physical, but quiet. A change in gaze, a new language of loyalty replacing curiosity. The transformation is almost invisible, unfolding in uniforms and mourning chants, in songs once sung for joy, now recited as duty. As you rest, consider how often history has used innocence as a blank page for propaganda. The tactic is as old as conflict itself. Reshape the next generation and you reshape the future. When children become weapons, the damage lingers. Written in memories, family silences, and a world where play is no longer free, but guided, carefully, by the hands of power. Imagine yourself seated at a long oak table, its surface covered with parchment and seals. The air in the chamber is cool, thick, with the scent of wax and old ink. Along the walls, shelves hold books describing the rights and freedoms promised to every citizen. These words seem sturdy, anchored in tradition, but you notice how easily they shift when fear enters the room. Across history, the ink of constitutions has proved more fluid than it appears. In times of calm, the rules feel unbreakable. But let a threat arise, a whisper of invasion, a rumor of unrest, an unseen enemy, and the same laws become pliable. Exceptions are written with careful hands, described as temporary, explained as necessary for safety. Rights pause, procedures change, and new powers bloom almost overnight. You can picture a judge reviewing an emergency decree, hands folded quietly as he weighs freedom against order. In the streets outside, citizens murmur about curfews, new checkpoints, sudden searches. These measures arrive with solemn promises, only for now, only until the danger passes. Yet with each repetition, what was once extraordinary becomes familiar, then permanent. In ancient republics, assemblies suspended rights during war, only to restore them slowly, sometimes not at all. In more recent times, crises bring new laws that never truly expire, lingering in the background long after fear has faded. Imagine a scribe copying amendments in the pale light of morning, wondering how many times words can be rewritten before they lose their shape. The rhythm of government, so steady in times of peace, now beats faster, every decision justified by the language of crisis. Picture yourself rising from that table, stepping out into the city. The banners still fly, the Constitution still rests in its place of honor. Yet you sense the texture of daily life has changed, subtly molded by exceptions that refuse to let go. Imagine yourself standing in a grand hallway, walls lined with formal portraits, faces carefully composed, eyes steady, hands arranged just so. The rhythm of daily life in such places is shaped by ceremony and spectacle. Visitors pause, admiring the gleam of medals or the richness of uniform, the subtle artistry that presents each subject as dignified, almost benevolent. These images become familiar, printed in books, stamped on coins, displayed in every public space, offering reassurance that order and greatness reside at the very top. Yet, behind the painted smiles and polished lenses, another story often unfolds. The leaders most devoted to their public image are sometimes those most ruthless in private. Orders given in secret, laws written to silence dissent, decisions that inflict hardship on millions. None of these are visible in the portrait's serene gaze. Imagine staff hurrying through side corridors, the quiet efficiency with which unpleasant truths are hidden, uncomfortable questions deflected. The rhythm of governance is maintained not only by power, but by careful control of what is seen and remembered. When visitors ask about the rumors, they are shown photographs of parades, reports of progress, and testimonials from chosen voices. The portrait becomes a shield, discouraging doubt and encouraging admiration. History, meanwhile, gathers whispers, stories of vanished rivals, forbidden books, or silent streets after curfew. Yet for many, the image endures. The leader remains a symbol of order and pride, while the suffering behind the scenes is quietly erased. Over generations, these portraits outlast their subjects, but beneath the varnish, the truth persists. In archives, in memories, in the slow revelation that image, however carefully crafted, can never fully hide the cost of cruelty. Imagine yourself in a quiet room where whispers carry more weight than footsteps. Across centuries, the rhythm of suspicion pulses beneath society's surface. What once was heresy, a belief outside accepted doctrine, became a crime punishable by fire or exile. Imagine scholars hunched over forbidden texts, fearful that mere possession might mark them as enemies. Over time, the focus shifted from belief to expression. Words once safely spoken in private circles grew dangerous under new laws. Today, concepts like hate speech attempt to draw lines around what thoughts may be voiced aloud. Yet the impulse remains the same: to police the unseen, to punish the unspoken. Imagine the tension of living where every glance or phrase might be scrutinized, where silence becomes a shield and speech a risk. This ongoing cycle reveals a deeper fear, that certain ideas threaten power or social order. Thought becomes crime again and again, echoing through history's halls. The tools change, but the pattern endures, quietly shaping the boundaries of freedom and control. Imagine yourself in a sunlit town square where neighbors gather to discuss the day's news. The voices are low, the debates gentle, each person believing their opinion matters. For a while, the rhythm of daily life is shaped by a sense of participation, voting, speaking, listening, even disagreeing. Yet, if you watch closely over time, small changes begin to settle in like dust on old stone. Democracy, history shows, rarely ends with loud proclamations or dramatic collapse. Instead, it fades quietly through ordinary habits. A few people stop showing up to vote. A law is passed that makes the process slower, or a rule changes the way districts are drawn. Meetings grow shorter, fewer voices are heard. Each step seems minor, just a matter of paperwork, a technicality, a compromise meant to save time. The change is rarely noticed as it happens, but in hindsight, the pattern is clear. Consider how once vibrant republics slipped into quiet decline. Citizens lost interest, busy with work, or comforted by the promise that someone else would handle things. Forms piled up. Participation felt less urgent, less rewarding. Over years, rights and responsibilities that once seemed vital became optional, even burdensome. If you listen carefully, you can sense the slow hush that settles as democracy grows less permanent, not with violence, but with resignation. The day-to-day routine continues, but something essential is lost. In that gentle silence, you see how the greatest threat to democracy is often not an outside force, but the quiet belief that it will last without care or effort. And so, democracy slips away inch by inch, until one day, only the memory of its promise remains. Imagine yourself in a crowded trading hall as morning light slants through high windows, catching dust motes in the air. The tick of the clock blends with the low hum of voices, a rhythm as steady as breathing. For months, the market's routine has felt reliable. Numbers rise and fall in familiar patterns, fortunes made and lost with a logic that seems almost mechanical. Yet beneath the surface, a different current flows, one built not of numbers, but of nerves. One morning, a rumor starts. A company in trouble, a sudden shift in policy, a possibility whispered but not yet proven. At first, few pay attention. Then the rumor grows, carried from desk to desk, whispered over coffee, embedded in urgent notes. Doubt spreads faster than any fact could travel. The calculations that once guided decisions are set aside. Eyes flicker to screens where prices begin to drop, slowly at first. Then, with gathering speed, the crowd's energy sharpens, voices rise, and soon, panic takes hold. Buy and sell orders flood the system, not for profit, but from fear of being left behind. Imagine the silent aftermath. Empty chairs, abandoned ledgers, screens blinking with losses no calculation could prevent. Economists later trace the cause, pointing to fundamentals and trends. But those inside the moment remember only the heat of anxiety, the way uncertainty leapt from one mind to the next. It is not numbers that drive markets to disaster, but emotion, a ripple of panic, a sudden lack of trust, the invisible contagion of fear. As you prepare for rest, consider how often the greatest shocks in history begin not with a crisis in resources, but with a crisis in feeling. Panic, not math, crashes economies. In the end, the most volatile market is not of goods or shares, but of human confidence itself. Imagine yourself in a quiet office filled with stacks of forms and humming machines. The light is soft, filtered through frosted glass, casting long rectangles on the tiled floor. Rows of cabinets line the walls, each drawer neatly labeled. Census records, credit histories, medical charts. The air smells faintly of ink and paper, carrying the silent weight of so many details gathered and stored. In the beginning, these numbers were collected to help. Census takers moved from house to house, counting neighbors and recording occupations to build schools, roads, and clinics. Doctors kept careful notes to track illness and recovery, hoping to better serve their patients. Banks created files to measure trust, offering loans to help dreams take shape. Each record began as a promise, a way to bring order and opportunity to daily life. But slowly, the purpose shifts. Imagine a clerk at a desk sorting through reports. He does not know the faces behind the numbers, only the patterns they reveal. Over time, the data grows more powerful than the stories it contains. Census lists are used to target dissenters or outsiders. Credit scores become barriers instead of bridges, closing doors as often as they open them. Medical records, once private, become tools to determine access or exclusion. In older times, authorities used census rolls to identify groups for taxation or for punishment. In the 20th century, data was turned against entire populations, sorted and surveilled with frightening efficiency. Today, algorithms sift personal details, shaping advertisements, job offers, even freedom of movement in ways most people never see. Picture yourself leafing through these records, feeling the cold weight of impersonal knowledge. What began as a promise to help now becomes a silent mechanism for control. The rhythm of daily life, once guided by trust and care, is gradually replaced by the logic of numbers, measured, sorted, and used, often without a word. Imagine yourself seated at a polished table in a quiet government office, the walls lined with shelves of official documents. The air smells faintly of paper and ink, and the conversation is measured, full of technical terms, statistics, and reassurances. The rhythm of daily life for many begins here, with decisions made far from the public square. It is in these rooms that policies are drafted, and with them, the course of ordinary lives is quietly redirected. On the surface, every policy seems practical. Quotas designed for efficiency, taxes to promote fairness, restrictions claimed to protect or improve society. Each rule arrives neatly typed and carefully justified, introduced in a tone of calm authority. But beneath the language of progress, harm can take root. Imagine families who find themselves excluded by a new residency law, or small traders forced out by sudden levies, or entire neighborhoods reshaped by a zoning code that favors one group over another. The impact is rarely immediate or visible. It is slow, cumulative, a kind of silent poison woven into the fabric of daily existence. For those affected, the shift is subtle at first, a lost opportunity, a closed door, a sense that life has grown just a little more difficult. The policymakers, distant in both geography and empathy, should rarely witness the hardship their decisions cause. Their faces remain composed, their statements full of promise. The cruelty wears a tie, is delivered by letterhead, and is defended by logic that rarely sees the suffering it produces. Over time, the harm becomes normalized. The language of exclusion becomes familiar, its consequences hidden beneath the routine of administration. And so, poison hides in policy. Its effects spread quietly, transforming communities not through violence, but through official words, measured signatures, and the daily machinery of power. Imagine yourself walking through a city where the streets hum with routine, but feel strangely empty. Faces pass by without recognition. Conversations dissolve into background noise, and the urgent questions of yesterday fade into silence. This is the rhythm of numbness, a quiet withdrawal from the pulse of life. In the years before great collapses, whether empires or economies, a similar pattern unfolds. Citizens stop responding to warnings, officials ignore growing cracks, and communities drift apart beneath the surface. Imagine the market stalls, once vibrant with trade, now still and dusty. The news reports grow repetitive, and the public's gaze turns inward, detached and resigned. This collective numbness softens resistance and dulls hope, making collapse less a sudden event than a slow, inevitable drift. It is the final stage before everything changes, the moment when care dies quietly, leaving the system vulnerable to the shock it no longer senses. In this silence, the foundations crumble, and history waits to be rewritten. Imagine yourself in a quiet town just after a major upheaval. The old authorities are gone, but nothing new has settled in their place. At night, people gather in small groups, voices lowered, trying to make sense of uncertain days. With few facts to rely on, rumors take root easily, filling the silence with whispered explanations. Each story feels urgent, as if it holds the key to hidden dangers or secret plans. Throughout history, whenever trust in leadership or information falters, conspiracies rush in to fill the void. Uncertainty invites the mind to draw connections, to seek meaning in coincidence, to revive the darkest myths of earlier times. What begins as a simple question, who is in charge, what really happened, it quickly becomes a tapestry of suspicion and accusation. Consider the aftermath of political crises, when official news grows scarce or inconsistent. It is in these gaps that old stories reemerge, secret societies pulling strings, enemies hiding in plain sight, traitors among neighbors. These tales are passed along with a sense of urgency, growing larger with each retelling. The rhythm of daily life becomes unsettled, shaped by fear and the hope for clarity. Even when new leaders arrive and attempt to restore order, the conspiracy stories linger. They are comforting in their own way, offering simple explanations where reality is messy and uncertain. If you look closely, you'll see this cycle repeating itself. Truth recedes, fiction fills the gap, and the oldest fears are given new voices. In the hush of transition, conspiracies become anchors, binding people together in shared belief, even when those beliefs stray far from what is real. Imagine yourself walking through a garden at the edge of a quiet village. Early morning light filters through dew-laden leaves, the air fragrant with the promise of new growth. The word cleansing sounds innocent here, suggesting a gentle renewal, the removal of what no longer belongs so that life can thrive. In many languages, the metaphors are soothing, to weed, to prune, to purify. Yet throughout history, these same words have been carried far beyond the garden walls, repurposed as the language of violence. Leaders announce new campaigns of renewal and restoration, promising to restore a community's health by removing whatever is deemed unfit. The rhetoric is smooth, almost hypnotic. Lists are drawn, neighbors are named. The lines between belonging and exclusion are redrawn in meetings held behind closed doors. At first, the changes seem orderly, even natural, like the quiet work of gardeners clearing dead leaves. But soon, the work grows harsher. The removal becomes forced, the language hardens, and gentle metaphors are replaced by silent processions in the night. Imagine the silence that follows. Streets emptied, homes abandoned, memories erased as though swept away with yesterday's leaves. Survivors speak in cautious tones, knowing that to question the cleansing is to question the new order itself. The language lingers long after the violence has passed, woven into official histories and monuments. Purity and renewal become watchwords for forgetting, disguising the wounds left behind. As you prepare to rest, consider how words meant for gardens are repurposed in the service of cruelty. Euphemism is its own kind of erasure. When you hear the call to cleanse or purify, remember how often those gentle phrases have masked the sharpest acts of harm, leaving scars that outlast the memory of violence itself. Imagine yourself in a dim workshop at the edge of a busy market. The air is thick with the scent of wood shavings and distant bread, sunlight slanting through dusty windows. At a small table, a craftsman sits, turning a coin over in his palm. The mark on its surface promises help, a loan to tide him through a bad harvest or repair his broken tools. The offer seems simple. Take what you need, pay it back in time. But behind the ease is another story. In ancient Rome, farmers borrowed seed or grain with the hope of next year's bounty. If the rains failed, debt grew heavy, and soon the land itself could be lost, transferred to creditors or the state. What began as a rescue became a tether, one quietly fastened, impossible to shake loose. You can picture a merchant in medieval Venice signing his name at the bottom of a ledger. The ink dries quickly, but the obligation lasts for years. Each month, a payment is due. Each missed coin means another compromise, another visit from a stern-faced collector. Over time, the rhythm of his work is set not by craft or market, but by the need to repay what was borrowed. Debt always arrives wrapped in the language of help. A banker assures security. A ruler forgives today's due, but demands new tribute tomorrow. In more modern times, promises of education or a new home are linked to invisible chains, interest rates, late fees, contracts that quietly shape every decision. Imagine yourself tracing the outlines of one of these contracts, feeling how the words promise freedom yet deliver constraint. The rhythm of daily life shifts. Hope is always just ahead, but the leash of debt keeps you circling the same ground. Over centuries, the names and forms have changed, but the pattern is familiar. Debt, always framed as a path to prosperity, so often becomes the tool that binds, softly at first, then with a grip that shapes the rest of a life. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a crowded square, the air vibrating with the pulse of voices rising and falling in unison. The faces around you are tense, their eyes fixed on a distant figure or symbol, hands raised in gestures both urgent and familiar. The rhythm of daily life has been interrupted, replaced by the collective beat of a crowd, each shout echoing an old pattern that feels both ancient and immediate. If you listen closely, the words chanted today often mirror those from generations past. Calls for justice, for vengeance, for belonging. The flags and banners change with the times, but the deeper urges remain the same. Imagine the swirling dust, the press of bodies, the heat of shared anger or hope. There is a strange comfort in the crowd's unity, a sense of protection in numbers, but also a risk. The line between solidarity and violence can blur with startling speed. You might recall scenes from old chronicles, mobs gathering in the streets of ancient cities, torches lit, voices raised against rulers or outsiders, the cadence of their chants, the pattern of their movements, the shared certainty, all return again and again, regardless of the century or cause. It is as if history replays itself through each new gathering, the rage and longing of countless past moments finding fresh voices to inhabit. As the crowd surges, individuals fade into the group. Decisions are made together, and yet by no one in particular. The aftermath is always quieter. Shredded banners left behind, the echo of chants fading into silence, the square slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm. And so, mobs echo ancient rhythms, their energy undiminished by time, reminding us that while the world changes, the pulse of collective rage follows a pattern as old as memory itself. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit chamber where the walls hold echoes of whispered fears and wild ideas. A brilliant mind paces restlessly, ideas bursting like sparks in the dark, misunderstood and feared by those outside. This is the rhythm of madness before recognition, a solitude heavy with isolation. History is filled with such figures, artists, thinkers, and inventors confined by the very societies that later celebrated their genius. Imagine Vincent van Gogh, whose vivid paintings were dismissed during his lifetime, yet now hang in museums worldwide. Or Nikola Tesla, whose revolutionary work was overshadowed by obscurity until long after his death. Their suffering, once a source of shame or neglect, becomes a legend told in hushed reverence. The madness that isolated them is romanticized, transformed into a symbol of tortured brilliance. But this admiration arrives too late, after the damage has been done, after the voices were silenced. The cycle repeats. Society fears what it does not understand, only to honor it once it can no longer be harmed. Imagine yourself at the edge of a village, far from the bustling market square. Here, the air feels cooler, and the sounds of daily life are quieter. People on the margins notice changes first: a strange cloud, a crop failing early, an unfamiliar traveler passing by. Their voices carry warnings, but in the center of power, where decisions are made and routines rarely break, such words are often met with a polite nod or a gentle dismissal. The rhythm of daily life flows on, unchanged. Throughout history, the first signs of trouble have come from those rarely invited to speak: outsiders, wanderers, or people whose livelihoods depend on reading subtle shifts, shepherds watching animal behavior, healers noticing patterns of illness, or laborers tracking shortages, raise their concerns quietly. But their distance from authority makes it easy to ignore them. Consider the records of disasters and epidemics. Often, someone noticed early signs long before leaders responded. Sometimes it was a doctor in a remote town, or a villager warning of a rising river. But official attention arrives slowly, if at all. By the time the center finally listens, the danger has grown, spreading from the edges inward. If you look closely, you'll see this pattern repeating. The wisdom of the margins is overlooked until urgency forces a response. Yet, even then, the center rarely admits where the first warning came from. In the quiet, you sense how every crisis carries the echo of unheard voices, reminders that those who watch from the edges are often the first to see what's coming and the last to be believed. Imagine yourself in a city that hums with quiet satisfaction. The market stalls overflow with fresh bread and ripe fruit, and the sound of laughter drifts from courtyards where musicians play for coins. On festival days, banners wave in the breeze, and the air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and sweet cakes. Even on ordinary evenings, there is a show to watch, a play, a storyteller, a game. In this atmosphere, daily concerns blur at the edges. Most people move through life without urgency, content to accept small inconveniences or private doubts as the price of comfort. Over time, subtle changes appear. The bread grows a little coarser, entertainment grows a little more repetitive. New rules arrive, more taxes, curfews, silent restrictions on speech. Yet as long as the routines continue, resistance feels unnecessary. People grumble in private, but rarely speak up in public. The soothing rhythm of daily pleasures muffles the sharper edges of discontent. For most, the thought of risking what comfort remains feels more frightening than enduring what has changed. Imagine a neighbor who senses the difference first. She notices the rising cost of flour, the quiet disappearance of old songs, the sudden caution in friendly conversation. Still, even she hesitates. As long as there is bread on the table and a diversion in the square, the discomfort is easy to ignore. Only when shortages bite hard, when hunger interrupts the evening's show or the music falls silent, does the city's rhythm falter. History turns at the point where comfort fails. When the bread runs out, when the distractions end, a restless energy takes hold. The urge to act, long numbed by ease, awakens with startling force. As you drift toward sleep, consider how comfort delays action more reliably than fear. It is only when the gentle lulls are broken, when daily pleasures cannot conceal hardship, that people find the courage to demand something new. Imagine yourself in a quiet tea house, the scent of sweet smoke curling through the air. Outside, the city pulses with life, but here time moves gently, slowed by comfort. On low tables, small bowls of poppy-laced tea are passed from hand to hand. The conversation drifts, softened by pleasure. What began as a ritual of hospitality soon becomes routine, and then dependence, a pattern woven into daily life by design, not by accident. In colonial ports, ships unloaded chests of opium, turning addiction into an industry. Merchants praised its calming effects. Doctors prescribed it as remedy. Rulers taxed its sale. Over time, the line between comfort and control blurred. Generations grew up in a world where submission to pleasure was not just tolerated, but quietly encouraged. You can picture a scribe recording the arrival of each shipment in neat columns. He knows the city grows quieter as the trade expands, less prone to unrest. When discomfort stirs, another pipe is lit, another dream is sold. The rhythm of daily life becomes laced with these gentle escapes until resistance feels distant and effort dissolves into haze. In modern times, the substances have changed, but the pattern holds. Screens flicker, offering infinite novelty at the touch of a finger. Notifications become a kind of soft reward, flooding the mind with brief delight. Each scroll, each click, another drop of pleasure, designed, refined, and distributed as efficiently as any drug. Imagine yourself glancing at a glowing screen late at night, the city outside silent, the world narrowed to a single stream of images. The sensation is familiar, a gentle drift, a docile comfort. The boundaries between choice and habit blur. Across centuries and continents, addictions have been installed by culture and commerce alike, not always by force, but by offering relief, convenience, distraction. The rhythm of their lives softens, and so does the will to question why. Imagine yourself in a bustling town square at midday, banners rippling in the breeze, and the sound of music drifting from a distant bandstand. Children run beneath grand statues of armored heroes, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic thump of drums. The rhythm of daily life is shaped for a time by celebration, pageants and parades, speeches praising courage, songs that promise honor and unity. There is a sense of anticipation in the air, as if greatness waits just beyond the horizon. In these moments, war is a story told in bold colors and shining brass. Artists paint stirring scenes, poets recite lines that stir the heart, and newspapers print maps marked with distant lands and noble missions. The prospect of conflict becomes a spectacle, safe and clean, elevated above the quiet uncertainties of ordinary existence. You might see young men lining up, uniforms crisp, families watching with a mixture of pride and worry. The promises are always the same: swift victory, lasting glory, a better world. Yet beneath the surface, the rituals of glorification are old and familiar. Statues erected today recall ancient triumphs. The songs echo those sung in centuries past. The celebration creates a rhythm that is both comforting and ominous, as if rehearsing for something inevitable. And then, almost imperceptibly, the mood changes. Orders are given, borders tighten, and the first sounds of real war, distant gunfire, hurried farewells, break the festive spell. The square, once filled with color and music, grows quieter. Flags remain, but their meaning darkens. The ordinary routines resume, marked now by absence and uncertainty. Over generations, this cycle repeats. The glory always comes before the horror, and the celebration always precedes the lessons learned in silence and sorrow. Imagine yourself in a bustling marketplace where once clear words now feel heavy and uncertain, like whispers caught in fog. The rhythm of conversation slows as meanings shift beneath the surface. When language loses its grip on truth, the foundations of trust begin to crumble. History shows this pattern time and again. In ancient Rome, political speeches twisted facts until citizens no longer knew who to believe. In more recent times, propaganda reshaped words like freedom and security into tools of control. Imagine a society where safety means silence, where justice becomes a mask for punishment. As words unravel, so do the bonds that hold communities together. Agreements become fragile, promises empty, and fear takes root in the gaps left by lost meaning. This erosion does not happen overnight. It is a slow fracture, subtle and pervasive. When language fails, the structure beneath, the shared reality that gives life shape, begins to crack, signaling the first tremors of collapse. Imagine yourself in a city square, the usual sounds of mourning replaced by anxious murmurs. News of a crisis has arrived, perhaps a threat, perhaps a disaster, and with it comes a sense of uncertainty that settles over daily routines. Laws are still posted in neat letters on public walls, and officials recite promises about rights and freedoms. But as fear grows, something subtle begins to shift. Throughout history, the rights that seem absolute in calm times become negotiable when danger rises. Restrictions are announced, often explained as temporary, just until the emergency passes. Curfews are set, assemblies limited, and privacy quietly reduced. The rhythm of ordinary life is interrupted by new orders, each justified by the need for security or stability. Consider how, in moments of national emergency, even long-standing constitutions can be stretched or set aside. Leaders quote foundational texts, reminding citizens of their rights, but the reality is often different. A right to assemble, to speak freely, to move without scrutiny, each is quietly redefined, measured against the needs of the moment. If you look closely, you'll notice how this pattern repeats. The letter of the law remains visible, but its spirit fades in the shadow of crisis. When the fear ebbs, some freedoms return, but not always as they were before. In that gentle drift between normalcy and emergency, you can sense how quickly rights can become privileges, granted or withdrawn according to circumstance. And in the quiet aftermath, the memory of what was lost lingers longer than any official proclamation. Imagine yourself in a small town where each street is swept clean and gardens bloom behind neatly painted fences. The air is thick with pride in belonging, shared rituals, shared beliefs, and a quiet assurance that this place is set apart, somehow more refined than the world beyond its borders. At first, the word purity sounds harmless. It is whispered in prayers, woven into stories, and painted on the walls of the meeting hall. People wear it like a badge, certain that by holding themselves apart, they are preserving something precious. But as the seasons pass, the meaning of purity shifts. What began as gentle pride grows sharper, dividing the community in ways that are almost invisible at first. A new neighbor is judged for unfamiliar customs. An old friend is shunned for a small mistake. The boundaries tighten, and each act of exclusion is explained as a way to protect the whole. There is talk of renewal and cleansing, soft words that quietly redraw the lines of who belongs and who does not. Imagine the sense of unease that settles in. Children ask why certain families are gone. Elders hush them, insisting that it is better not to question. The rituals grow stricter, the rules more demanding. Dissent is unwelcome, even dangerous. Over time, the quest for purity hardens into suspicion and then into fear. The very thing meant to unite becomes a reason to divide, to cast out, to forget compassion. As you prepare to rest, Consider how many times in history the search for purity has ended not in harmony, but in violence. Whether rooted in race, faith, or morals, obsession with purity rarely stays gentle. It is a quiet descent, one small act of exclusion at a time, until blood marks the very ground once thought to be sacred. And long after the moment passes, the memory lingers, warning softly against the promise of perfect belonging. Imagine yourself in a quiet chamber lined with ledgers and abacuses. The air carries the scent of chalk and old ink, each desk covered in columns of numbers, tidy and impersonal. Clerks move quietly between tables, recording tallies, compiling lists. To the eye, it is the work of order and routine, figures calculated, outcomes projected, everything reduced to a sum. But beneath the calm, numbers gather their own kind of power. In distant wars, commanders count victories by the bodies recorded, never the names. A report arrives, not as a story of loss, but as a list of statistics. Targets reached, quotas met, percentages improved. The larger the figure, the more abstract the suffering becomes. Pain is made manageable by the math. You can picture a scribe in a candlelit office, his pen scratching out another tally. He tells himself it is necessary work, that the numbers are all that matter. In cities and camps, policies are shaped by these calculations. How many can be spared? How many must be sent away? How much production is enough to meet the plan? The logic is cold, almost soothing, turning chaos into neat rows of digits. History repeats this pattern. In famines, relief is rationed by head count, not by need. In prisons, sentences are tallied to maintain a statistical balance. In bureaucracies, suffering is weighed and measured until the decision becomes just another step in a process. The horror feels justified, almost invisible, when framed by numbers on a page. Imagine yourself sitting at one of these desks, tracing the lines from one sum to the next. The work feels clean, rational, detached from the messiness of life. Yet, in the space between numbers, real lives vanish, turned into data, excused by calculation. The rhythm of atrocity becomes a sequence of figures, leaving only a quiet, unsettling order where empathy once belonged. Imagine yourself walking through the marble halls of a great palace, sunlight catching on gilded ceilings and stained glass windows. The rhythm of daily life for those inside is shaped by beauty. Elegant clothing, fragrant gardens, the delicate clatter of porcelain in quiet tea rooms. Outside, grand avenues are lined with statues and fountains, public squares adorned with flowers and banners, each detail carefully arranged to please the eye and soothe the mind. Yet, just beyond these displays, you might notice narrow alleys where the scent of bread is rare and the sound of hunger interrupts the morning. The contrast is stark, but carefully maintained. Art and architecture, music and fashion are polished to brilliance. Each new masterpiece celebrated as a triumph of civilization. Visitors marvel at the towering cathedrals or the graceful lines of a new dress, the city's image carefully cultivated for admiration. For those who govern, beauty becomes more than ornament. It is a shield. Difficult questions fade beneath the dazzle of a new festival, a painted ceiling, or a glittering ceremony. Pain is hidden in plain sight, masked by the comfort of familiar routines and pleasing views. Imagine standing at a balcony during a parade, the crowd below distracted by color and spectacle, while quietly, the problems of the poor or the desperate are kept out of sight. Over time, this pattern repeats. The splendor of art and architecture, meant to inspire or uplift, is also used to distract and reassure. The city's surface glows while suffering is hushed behind closed doors. In every age, beauty becomes a careful mask, protecting those in power from scrutiny and shielding the rest from truths that are harder to face, even as hunger and struggle continue in the shadow of so much elegance. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit office, where the hum of fluorescent lights blends with the soft rustle of papers being shuffled. The rhythm here is steady and unyielding. Forms signed, approvals granted, files moved from one desk to another. There is no urgency, no raised voices, only the quiet certainty of procedure. Yet within these motions lies a power far more chilling than any shout or gunfire. History holds countless stories where cold bureaucracy sealed fates with a stamp or a signature. Imagine families waiting for permits that never come, patients denied treatment because of missing paperwork, or refugees trapped in endless loops of administration. The system does not need violence. It controls through silence and delay, turning human lives into data points to be processed or discarded. Each form completed is a small decision that, multiplied across millions, determines who lives and who dies. This quiet machinery grinds on, invisible and relentless, proving that sometimes death arrives not with noise, but through the cold efficiency of rules obeyed without question. Imagine yourself walking through a city in the early morning, streets quieter than usual. Shop windows display fewer goods, and anxious faces glance out from behind drawn curtains. Yet, behind the closed doors of grander houses, another rhythm is unfolding. Phones ring, deals are made, and fortunes quietly shift. Throughout history, every crisis, be it war, famine, or disease, has created new winners and losers. While most people tighten their belts and wait for normal life to return, a small group seizes opportunity. Properties change hands at bargain prices, supplies are bought up and resold at a premium, and markets move in response to panic. In these moments, wealth flows not away from disaster, but toward it, gathering like water in the lowest places. Consider how, during economic downturns or emergencies, the value of essentials rises sharply. Those with resources on hand can buy when others must sell. A warehouse of grain or medicine, a portfolio of distressed assets, becomes a lever for greater influence. Behind the scenes, suffering is quietly transformed into stock and shares, and tragedy becomes another kind of marketplace. Even when the crisis passes, the effects linger. Inequality grows wider. The very structures built to respond to emergencies, banks, corporations, and supply chains, become more concentrated in fewer hands. If you listen closely, you can sense this pattern repeating. Hardship at the surface, advantage moving silently below. And as daily life resumes, the memory of what was gained and lost quietly shapes the future, long after the panic has faded. Imagine yourself listening to the morning news in a quiet kitchen, sunlight spilling across the table. The voices you hear speak of new crises, fresh beginnings, sudden changes, each event dressed in the language of uniqueness, as if the world were forever unfolding in unprecedented ways. Yet as you sip your tea, you might feel a subtle echo beneath the headlines, a sense that these stories, though urgent, are not entirely unfamiliar. In every era, people believe their challenges are original. The names change, kings become presidents, plagues become recessions, empires become unions, but the rhythms remain. Hope rises with every promised solution, only to falter and return in a form slightly altered, slightly disguised. It is not until someone quietly names the pattern, reminds others that this too has happened before, that the illusion begins to fade. In that naming, the cycle reveals itself. Revolutions that promise freedom, followed by new constraints. Economic booms that end in uncertainty. Leaders praised, then doubted, then replaced. Imagine the comfort and discomfort that comes with recognizing these patterns. There is relief in knowing you are not alone, that generations before have faced the same tides of hope and disillusionment. Yet there is also a gentle sadness, an awareness that lessons must be learned and forgotten, again and again, before the world is ready to notice the shape of its own repetitions. As you drift toward sleep, consider how much of life feels startling until it is named. Every cycle appears new until someone draws the lines between then and now. History does not repeat itself precisely, but it rhymes, quietly, beneath the noise of daily life. And once you hear that familiar refrain, the world's endless novelty becomes something softer, a story always in motion, but rarely truly new. Imagine yourself walking through a modern laboratory, the hum of machines blending with the quiet voices of researchers. The air is cool, tinged with the sterile scent of alcohol and new electronics. On the walls, sleek posters promise a brighter future. Words like optimization, genetic fitness, and efficiency, repeated in soft, persuasive fonts. Each phrase sounds reassuring, even benevolent. Yet, if you listen closely, you'll notice echoes of an older, harsher ambition woven beneath. A century ago, the same hope for human improvement took a different name. Eugenics was spoken with pride, policies drawn up with the authority of science. Charts and ledgers determined who could marry, who could have children, who was deemed fit. The results were devastating, but always presented as rational for the greater good. As public memory recoiled from these abuses, the words changed. The ideology did not. Now, optimization promises healthier children. Efficiency means allocating resources away from the vulnerable. Fitness becomes a quiet filter for belonging. The forms of measurement grow more technical, the language more refined, but the hierarchy remains. You might picture a geneticist studying a string of data, speaking gently about potential and risk. The conversation is careful, but the implications are ancient. An unspoken decision about whose lives are valuable and whose can be set aside for progress. Imagine a family listening as an expert explains the results of a test, hopeful and anxious. What is offered as choice sometimes narrows into subtle pressure. The story of improvement is told again, just with new vocabulary. The rhythm of history is persistent. Beliefs once denounced resurface with different names. Efficiency and optimization sound modern, even compassionate, but you can feel the familiar edge beneath the words. The belief that some lives matter more is never truly erased, only quietly repackaged, waiting for its next moment in the light. Imagine yourself in a darkened theater, the scent of popcorn drifting through the aisles as a screen glows with images from the distant past. The rhythm of daily life slows for a moment as audiences gather, drawn to stories of ancient battles, sweeping disasters, or the rise and fall of forgotten empires. Faces once marked by real fear and hunger are now played by actors. Tragedies that once emptied cities are recreated with costumes and soundtracks, the line between memory and spectacle blurred by the flicker of light. On television and in books, mass suffering is carefully edited into drama. The slow agony of famine becomes a montage. A war that spanned decades shrinks to 2 quick hours, and a single, haunting photograph is transformed into a symbol, stripped of its context. The horror becomes manageable, exciting or moving, perhaps even comforting in its distance. You might notice how the most difficult lessons of history are softened, reimagined to fit a familiar plot, the sharp edges dulled for easy viewing. As the credits roll and the lights return, real pain lingers only briefly. Conversation drifts to favorite scenes or characters, details fade, and the weight of what truly happened slips quietly away. The rhythm of ordinary life resumes, but now shaped by stories told not to warn or mourn, but to entertain. The cycle repeats. History's warnings become entertainment. The past is repackaged for amusement, and the urge to watch and then forget allows the same patterns of suffering, of silence, of spectacle to quietly return again and again. Imagine yourself at the end of a long day, body heavy and mind dulled by hours of relentless work or worry. The world around you blurs into a haze where resistance feels impossible and compliance slips in like a quiet tide. This is the rhythm of exhaustion, a slow surrender not born of choice, but carefully cultivated. Throughout history, those in power have understood that a weary population is easier to manage. Imagine factory workers in the Industrial Revolution, laboring for endless shifts with little rest, their fatigue dulling the spark of rebellion. Or consider modern societies where constant demands, economic pressures, social unrest Endless noise wear down vigilance. Exhaustion becomes not a mere side effect, but a deliberate tool, sapping energy needed to question, to protest, to demand change. The tired obey more easily because their capacity to resist is diminished. In this state, control becomes subtle and nearly invisible, embedded in the very rhythm of daily survival. Fatigue quiets the mind and softens defiance, ensuring that power flows uninterrupted through the cracks left by worn-out souls. Imagine yourself listening to the soft hum of a television in a dimly lit living room. News tickers flash urgent headlines. Commercial breaks feature new products for safety, security, and peace of mind. The tone never quite relaxes. There's always a reason to worry, another warning, another solution offered for a price. In the background, you sense that fear itself has become the main event. Throughout history, moments of panic have attracted not just attention, but profit. Corporations design products that promise protection, alarm systems, insurance plans, and masks. The media competes to capture your gaze, reporting every risk in detail and repeating stories until anxiety lingers in the air long after the program ends. Leaders, too, find advantage in shaping and steering public worry, promising answers that often require new spending, new subscriptions, or new support. Consider how each new crisis brings a wave of marketing. Headlines turn ordinary problems into looming threats. Products that were once optional become urgent needs. Companies sponsor segments about solutions, and advertisements slip in between news updates, reminding viewers that peace of mind is always just one purchase away. If you pause to reflect, you'll notice the rhythm. Panic is not only reported, but carefully maintained. The feeling of insecurity becomes a kind of currency, circulating through screens, stores, and speeches. In that gentle, persistent hum of worry, you can sense how crisis is rarely resolved completely. Instead, it is repackaged, sold, and repeated, turning fear itself into a business model that never quite lets you rest. AQ. Imagine yourself standing on a windswept plain where the grass bends under the weight of old footsteps. Here, long after the clamor of battle has faded, the real conflict quietly begins. It is not waged with swords or shouts, but with stories, each side trying to shape what will be remembered. In the hush after conflict, elders gather around fires and retell the events, choosing which details to illuminate and which to let drift into shadow. The ground is quiet, but the air is thick with the struggle for memory. Over time, these stories harden into monuments, textbooks, and commemorations. The victor's version becomes law, etched in stone or repeated in classrooms, yet memory is never fixed. In back rooms and hidden diaries, alternative histories survive, whispered from one generation to the next. Each account competes for space in the collective mind, twisting the legacy of what truly happened. Imagine the cost of this struggle. When memory is contested, the present becomes unstable. Laws are rewritten, monuments torn down, ancestors celebrated or condemned. New battles are waged not for territory, but for the right to define the past. In some places, entire generations are raised on stories that erase their grandparents' pain or inflate their victories. For many, the search for truth becomes exhausting, the line between remembrance and forgetting blurring until it is almost invisible. As you drift into rest, consider how the fiercest battles are often fought in silence, in archives, in ceremonies, in the way each generation decides what will be retold. The fight for memory is a fight for the future. Whoever shapes the past shapes the world that comes after, as surely as any army ever could. In this endless contest, memory is the real prize, and its guardians the quiet victors or vanquished of every age. Imagine yourself walking down a quiet corridor lined with portraits and faded proclamations. The air is heavy with the scent of dust and old paper, as if memory itself has settled here. Along the walls, inscriptions declare promises and warnings, words spoken in the aftermath of disaster, each vowing that such tragedy must never return. Never again, they say, carved into marble and recited in solemn ceremonies. But as you move further down the hall, you notice how these words repeat. Each never again stands beside another, older one. Different eras, different faces, but always the same echo. The warning is always sincere, felt deeply in the moment, after war, after famine, after cruelty has been exposed and mourned. The silence that follows is heavy, but history shows it is rarely the end. You can picture a scribe recording new resolutions with careful strokes, knowing he is copying from older texts, only the names and dates changed. There is comfort in ritual, in public remorse. Leaders gather to promise vigilance, communities gather to listen. For a while, the world seems changed, yet slowly, quietly, the habits of forgetting return. The same mistakes, dressed in new forms, begin to gather momentum once more. In every century, warnings ring out against violence, against injustice, against indifference. Yet the pattern persists. A new generation, hearing only distant echoes, believes itself wiser, until another, never again, is carved into stone. Imagine yourself pausing in this corridor, listening as the warnings stretch out behind and ahead of you, a refrain too familiar to ignore. The rhythm of history is relentless, each warning echoing into the next, real and urgent, but never quite loud enough to break the cycle.